Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. There is a word the Norse used as a verb before anyone used it as a noun. To go Viking, to go out, to try your luck on the water, to see what the world beyond the horizon was holding. It was not an identity. It was an action. And for roughly 270 years, from the summer a longship appeared off the coast of Northumbria in 793 to a cold September morning in 1066, when the last Norse king to claim England died on an English field. That action reshaped the known world more thoroughly than almost any other force of the medieval age. The people who did it came from 3 countries that did not yet fully exist, driven by pressures that were economic and political and personal all at once. They raided monasteries and founded parliaments. They traded silver in Baghdad and buried their dead in ships. They settled Iceland from nothing, reached the coast of North America 5 centuries before Columbus, and left their language so deeply inside the English tongue that when you say the words sky, window, husband, knife, or egg, you are speaking Norse. If you find Quiet Chronicles worth the company on nights like this, a like and a subscription go a long way. New history every week, waiting whenever you need it. What follows is the entire arc of the Viking Age, from the Scandinavian world that produced it to the autumn afternoon it ended, or rather, the afternoon it stopped being itself and became something else entirely. The story begins in the north. Chapter 1: The Shore They Left Behind. Norway in the 8th century was not a kingdom. It was a coastline, or more precisely, it was several hundred kilometers of interrupted coastline, broken into compartments by fjords that ran so deep into the interior that neighboring valleys could be separated by a day's sailing but 3 days of hard walking over mountain passes that closed entirely in winter. This geography did not produce isolation so much as it produced a particular kind of connectivity. The sea was not a barrier, but a road, and in a landscape where land travel was slow, seasonal, and exhausting, the ability to move by water was not a luxury, but the basic condition of economic life. Timber came down the fjords on rafts. Fish went out on the same water that brought iron back. Marriages were made between families who lived 20 kilometers apart by land and 40 minutes apart by boat. And the rhythms of farming and fishing and small-scale trade along the coast gave the Norse world of the 8th century its fundamental texture long before any raider appeared on any foreign shore. The land itself was the first constraint. Norway's habitable strip, the coastal terraces and valley floors where grain could be grown and cattle pastured, amounted to perhaps 3% of the country's total area, and that 3% was not evenly distributed. The southwestern coast had workable farmland. Further north, the valleys narrowed and the growing season shortened, and the margin between a good harvest and a difficult winter became genuinely thin. Denmark sat differently. Its flat peninsula and chain of islands gave it more arable land per person, and a natural position astride the sea routes between the Baltic and the North Sea, which made it a place where trade flowed through rather than a place that had to send people out to find it. Sweden's geography pointed east, toward the Great Lakes, the rivers, and the Baltic coast, which shaped where Swedish Norse energy would eventually flow. These were not yet countries with fixed boundaries and single rulers. They were regions of overlapping chieftaincies, family territories, and contested grazing rights, where a powerful man's authority extended as far as his reputation reached and no further. Population was growing. This is one of those demographic facts that is easy to state and difficult to feel the weight of, but it matters here because it is the most basic pressure behind everything that followed. Younger sons of farming families in Norway in the 8th century faced a problem that had no elegant solution within the existing landscape. The good land was already held. The marginal land required labor that might not repay the investment, and the social world of a Norse community offered limited room for a man without land to establish the kind of standing that made a full life possible. A man of consequence owned something. He hosted feasts. He could offer gifts and receive them in return. He could attract followers. Without a farm, without a ship, without some transferable asset, the possibilities contracted. This was not a crisis in the dramatic sense. It was a chronic pressure, the kind that accumulates quietly across generations until it finds a release. Chieftains operated at the center of this pressure. A Norse chieftain in the 8th century maintained his position through redistribution. He received tribute from those under his protection and converted it back into gifts, feasts, and equipment for the men who depended on him. The economy of reputation that surrounded this system was explicit and demanding. A chieftain who stopped giving stopped being a chieftain, not through any formal mechanism, but through the gradual withdrawal of loyalty that followed when the feasts became sparse and the gifts stopped coming. Raiding offered chieftains something the farming economy alone could not reliably provide: sudden, portable wealth, acquired outside the normal channels of agricultural surplus, available to be redistributed immediately in ways that reinforced reputation and rewarded followers. This is not to say that Norse chieftains raided because they had calculated the return on investment and found it favorable. It is to say that the social logic of their world made raiding legible, comprehensible, and in many cases admirable in a way that requires some effort for a modern reader to reconstruct. The ships made it possible, and the ships were not built for raiding. This is the point most easily missed when the longship appears in popular imagination as a weapon first and a vessel second. Norse ships were the basic infrastructure of a world where water was the primary road. The same vessel design that carried dried fish to a trading partner, that moved timber between islands, that brought a family and their livestock to a new settlement, was capable, with armed men aboard and the element of surprise, of striking a coastal target and withdrawing before any organized response could form. The technology was not invented for violence. It was adapted to violence, which is a different genealogy entirely. And the adaptation was made possible by specific features. The shallow draft that allowed beaching directly on a gravel shore, the double-ended hull that could be rowed in either direction without turning, the light construction that produced a vessel fast enough under oar to close distance quickly and withdraw before a heavier ship could intercept. It was into this world, pressured, seaborne, organized around reputation and redistribution, that a man named Othere arrived at the court of the English King Alfred the Great sometime in the 8080s. There was from Hålogaland, the far north of Norway, a region so remote that it lay beyond the normal boundaries of settled Norse life, where the winters were long enough that the sun did not rise for weeks and the summers were bright enough that it never fully set. He came to Alfred's court not as a raider or a soldier, but as a traveler with a story worth telling. And Alfred, whose intellectual curiosity was genuine and whose court was in the business of translating and preserving useful knowledge, had Othere's account written into the margins of a Latin geographical text he was having rendered into Old English. What Othere described was a voyage he had made north from his home, further north than any Norse person he knew of had gone, along the Norwegian coast and around the top of the peninsula, driven partly by curiosity about what lay beyond the settled world, and partly by the practical interest of a man who hunted walrus for their ivory and wondered what the hunting grounds beyond the northern capes contained. He sailed for days past the point where other Norse settlements ended, passed where the coastline was inhabited only by Sami people, whom he called Finns, and eventually rounded the North Cape and turned east, finding the White Sea and the mouth of a great river. He returned with walrus ivory and the story of what he had seen. The account survives because Alfred had it written down. It is one of the earliest first-person Norse travel narratives that exists in any form, and it is remarkable not for its drama. There describes his voyage with the measured calm of a man reporting useful information, but for what it reveals about the Norse relationship to the unknown. There went north beyond the settled world because he was curious about what was there. He found something and came back to describe it. This was not the behavior of a culture oriented purely toward violence and acquisition. It was the behavior of a seafaring world that had developed, alongside its capacity for raiding, a genuine disposition toward exploration, toward finding out what the next coastline held. The Norse world of the 8th and early 9th centuries was, in this sense, already pointed outward before the raids made it famous for going out. The raiding was not a sudden mutation in an otherwise inward-looking culture. It was one expression of a set of capacities, maritime, organizational, navigational, that were already developed and already being used for multiple purposes simultaneously. Trade and raiding and exploration and settlement were not separate Norse activities pursued by separate Norse people. They were options available to the same ships, the same crews, the same chieftains, depending on what a given coast offered and what the political situation at home required. A longhouse in 8th century Norway ran to 30 meters or more in length. Its interior divided between the living quarters of the family and the stalls where the cattle spent the winter. The shared warmth of the animals keeping the temperature above freezing on nights when the outside air was deeply cold. The smell of pine tar on new ship timbers was the smell of preparation. Every ship required regular retarring to stay seaworthy, and the process was seasonal, done in spring before the sailing season opened. A good sword cost the equivalent of a small farm. This was not metaphorical inflation, but a literal statement of comparative value in a world where iron was expensive to produce and a well-made blade required skill and time that could not be hurried. The brynja, the iron chainmail shirt that a well-equipped warrior wore, weighed 10 to 12 kilograms, required years of skilled labor to produce link by link, and represented an investment that most Norse fighting men could not make. Those who could were marked by it. These material facts are not incidental decoration. They define the scale of the world that is about to expand. A society in which a good sword costs a farm and chainmail costs more than most men will ever own is a society where the stakes of raiding are real and where the returns, when they come, matter. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced on an island monastery off the Northumbrian coast around 715, were bound in covers set with jewels. The monastery had accumulated treasure through a century of royal patronage, pilgrimage, and the gifts of the faithful. From the water, in the right season and the right wind, it was approximately 35 nautical miles from the Norwegian coast to the British Isles. Not a trivial crossing, but not an impossible one either for men who had grown up reading the sea. The shore they left behind was real and particular and constrained. The shore they were about to reach was wealthy, largely undefended from the water, and entirely unprepared for what was coming. What was coming did not announce itself. It appeared. Chapter 2: The First Shore Broken. The monastery of Lindisfarne stood on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, connected to the mainland by a causeway that the sea covered twice a day. This was, for the monks who lived there, a spiritual arrangement as much as a geographical one. The tide's daily erasure of the path to the world reinforced the sense that Lindisfarne existed at a remove from ordinary life, a place where the serious business of prayer and manuscript making could proceed without the constant interruptions of the mainland. The monastery had been founded in 635 by the Irish monk Aidan, who had come from Iona at the invitation of the Northumbrian king Oswald, and in the century and a half that followed, it had become one of the most venerated Christian sites in Britain. Kings were buried nearby, pilgrims arrived in season. The relics of Saint Cuthbert, the most beloved of the Northumbrian saints, rested there in a decorated coffin that had itself become an object of devotion. And sometime around 715, a team of monks had produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, a manuscript of the 4 Christian Gospels decorated with an intricacy and beauty that placed it among the finest objects made anywhere in Europe in its century. All of this accumulated sanctity and accumulated treasure sat on a low island off a coast that faced the open North Sea. On the 8th of June, 793, ships arrived. The sources do not agree on the number of ships. They do not preserve the names of the men aboard. What they preserve is the fact of it and the response to it, which is to say, they preserve the shock. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in Alfred's reign but drawing on earlier records, notes the event with characteristic brevity: ravaging and slaughter at Lindisfarne. Simeon of Durham, writing 3 centuries later but drawing on Northumbrian sources, adds detail. The pagans came to the church of Lindisfarne, laid everything waste with grievous plundering, trampled the holy places with polluted steps, dug up the altars, and seized all the treasures. Some monks were killed, he records. Some were dragged to the ships. Some were drowned. Some were stripped and driven away. What the Chronicle and Simeon together cannot provide is the interior of the event, what it felt like from inside the monastery when the ships were sighted, what the warning was, and whether there was one at all, how long the raid lasted before the ships withdrew. The only source that gives Lindisfarne any emotional texture is a letter written by a man who was not there. Alcuin of York was, at the time of the Lindisfarne raid, one of the most learned men in Europe, a statement that needs the context of what learning meant in the late 8th century to carry its proper weight. He had been educated at the Cathedral School of York, which held the finest library north of the Alps, and he had spent years building that library and the school's reputation before accepting an invitation from Charlemagne to join the Frankish court as the king's principal intellectual advisor. He was at Aachen when the news from Lindisfarne reached him. He had been born in Northumbria, educated in Northumbria, and spent the formative decades of his life there. And the monastery at Lindisfarne was not an abstraction to him. It was a place he knew, associated with figures he revered, and situated within a religious world he had spent his life serving. His letter to Aethelred, the king of Northumbria, was written within weeks of hearing the news. His letter survives in Latin, and what strikes a reader of it now, beyond the genuine anguish of the man writing it, is the interpretive framework Alcuin immediately reached for. He did not write about the raiders as a military problem requiring a military response. He wrote about them as a divine judgment. The raid on Lindisfarne was, in Alcuin's reading, a punishment sent by God for the sins of the Northumbrians, for the luxurious clothing of the clergy, for fornication, for the wickedness that had spread through the kingdom. The heathens from the north were the instrument of a correction that the Northumbrians had brought upon themselves. This was not, for Alcuin, a way of excusing the raiders. It was a way of understanding the event within the only explanatory system he had, and it reveals something important about how the Christian world of the late 8th century processed a threat it had no category for. His specific phrase, translated from the Latin, runs roughly, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made." This is the sentence historians have returned to repeatedly, because it makes a claim about novelty that matters. Alcuin was saying that this was new, not just a raid, but a kind of raid that had not happened before in British memory. A seaborne attack on a place of worship that arrived without warning and departed the same way. His shock was genuine. He was a man of precise intelligence, and he was telling Ethelred that whatever the king thought he understood about the dangers facing Northumbria, this was something outside that understanding. Ethelred received the letter in a kingdom already under dynastic strain. Northumbria in the 790s was going through the kind of political turbulence that made organized military response to external threats difficult. The king who had ruled when Alcuin was young had been killed, and a series of short reigns had followed, each ending in the violence that ended the one before. Ethelred himself had killed his predecessor and would be killed in turn before the decade was out. The political infrastructure that might have mounted a coastal defense was not functioning, and even had it been functioning, the problem the Norse raids presented, multiple points, seaborne approach, rapid withdrawal, had no solution that an 8th century English kingdom possessed. The raids continued. Iona, the great Irish monastery on a small island off the Scottish coast that had itself sent Aidan to Lindisfarne a century and a half earlier, was struck in 795. The monastery of St. Philibert at Noirmoutier, on an island off the Frankish coast, was raided in 799. A pattern was establishing itself. Islands, monasteries, places made vulnerable by water on all sides and wealthy by decades of patronage. The choice of targets was not random, and it was not purely opportunistic. Monastic treasures were concentrated, portable, and undefended in ways that most other wealth was not. Gold and silver reliquary covers, jeweled gospel bindings, fine metalwork produced by craftsmen working under monastic patronage. These were the most transferable forms of value available on the British and Frankish coasts, and they were held by institutions that had no soldiers and no walls. The monks of Noirmoutier understood this before the decade was out. They began spending winters on the mainland, returning each summer to work the island, and eventually they abandoned the island permanently, carrying St. Philibert's relics with them on a decades-long journey inland that became its own kind of pilgrimage. The relics of a saint in motion, fleeing the same threat that had disrupted every fixed coastal community from Northumbria to the Loire. There is a particular quality to the disruption the early raids produced that is easy to underestimate from a distance of 12 centuries. It was not simply the material damage, though the material damage was real. Manuscripts burned, treasures taken, buildings destroyed. It was the disruption of the assumption of safety in places that had defined themselves by their separation from the world's violence. A monastery was supposed to be, by the understanding of the age, a place under divine protection. The relics of saints were supposed to confer a sanctity that deterred harm. Lindisfarne had the relics of Cuthbert. Iona had the relics of Columba. These were not negligible spiritual assets, and the fact that they had not prevented the raids required explanation. Alcuin's letter was one attempt at explanation. Others followed, and the explanatory anxiety produced by the raids, the theological problem of understanding why God had permitted this, runs through the monastic chronicle literature of the following decades like a thread of unresolved distress. Meanwhile, in the places that had not yet been raided, the news traveled. Monasteries that lay on exposed coasts began making calculations they had never needed to make before. Where were the relics? How portable were the treasures? What was the approach by water? The community at Lindisfarne itself eventually made a decision that would have seemed impossible before 793. In 875, faced with renewed Viking pressure, they lifted the coffin of St. Cuthbert from its place in the church and carried it with them, beginning a wandering that lasted over a century before the saint found a permanent home at Durham. The most sacred fixed point of Northumbrian Christianity was put on people's shoulders and carried across the landscape for 100 years. That is a measure of what the raids had done to the geography of safety. What the Christian Chronicles do not record, because they had no mechanism to record it, is what the raiders made of what they found. The jeweled gospel bindings and the silver reliquary covers were melted and divided. The portable wealth of a century of Northumbrian royal patronage was converted into the currency of a different economy. Some of it went to chieftains who would use it to maintain their position through redistribution. The same economy of reputation that had made the raid worthwhile in the first place. Some of it became personal ornament. Some of it was buried against future need and never retrieved. A portion of the Lindisfarne treasure may be somewhere in the North Sea mud, or under Norwegian farmland, or long since melted into forms that no longer carry any trace of what they once were. The Lindisfarne Gospels survived. They had been taken off the island before the raid for reasons the sources do not explain, possibly in anticipation of a threat, possibly for some other purpose entirely. They still exist, held now in the British Library, their decorated pages as intricate as the day the monks finished them. The monastery that produced them was struck, disrupted, eventually abandoned. The book outlasted the community that made it, carried forward by circumstances that the men who illuminated it could not have anticipated and would not have chosen. Alcuin died in 804, having spent his final years as abbot of the monastery of St. Martin at Tours. He never returned to Northumbria. His letters from the years after Lindisfarne show a man who continued to believe that the raids were a moral problem as much as a military one, that the correct response was spiritual reform rather than coastal fortification. He was not wrong that the Northumbrian church had problems. He was simply addressing a phenomenon that was going to continue regardless of whether the clergy changed their clothing. The ships kept coming. Not every year, not to every coast, but they kept coming, and the knowledge that they could come, that any island, any coastal monastery, any place reachable by water and undefended by walls was potentially a target, was itself a transformation. The world that Alcuin had grown up in which a place of worship on a tidal island was safe by virtue of its sanctity, was gone. What replaced it was not yet clear. What was clear was that the first shore had been broken, and the water that came through would not easily be turned back. Chapter 3. The Law of the Thing. Oral law is not the absence of written law. It is a different technology for achieving the same purpose. The reliable transmission of binding rules across time and across a community. And in the Norse world of the 8th and 9th centuries, it was a technology that had been refined over generations into something genuinely sophisticated. The law speaker, the man whose elected function was to hold the entire legal code of his region in memory and recite it accurately on demand, was not a primitive substitute for a judge with a book. He was a specialist, trained from youth, whose memory was a public instrument, whose recitation was a civic performance, and whose accuracy was subject to challenge by anyone present who believed he had misremembered. The law was in his mouth. but it was owned by everyone who heard it. The thing, the assembly at which this law was performed and applied, was the central political institution of the Norse world, and it operated at multiple scales simultaneously. Local things handled local disputes. Regional things gathered representatives from wider territories. The thing was not a court in the sense of a permanent institution with appointed officials and fixed procedures. It was an event, held at a fixed time and a fixed place, marked by hazel poles driven into the ground to define the assembly space, and attended by free men who had both the right and, in many cases, the obligation to be present. The timing was seasonal, spring and summer, when travel was possible, when the farming cycle permitted absence, when the thing site was accessible. The assembly lasted roughly 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, the legal business of the community was conducted. What that business looked like in practice was messier and more human than the institutional description suggests. Men came to the thing with grievances that had been simmering for months. Families arrived as blocks, because a dispute between 2 men was always also a dispute between 2 networks of kinship and obligation, and the thing was the place where those networks made themselves publicly visible. Witnesses were called. Oaths were sworn. The law speaker recited the relevant law, and then the community, or more precisely, the free men present who had standing to vote, made a judgment, which could be accepted, negotiated, or, if the losing party refused it, converted into the beginning of something worse. Norse society arranged itself into 3 legal categories with a directness that left little room for ambiguity. Jarls were the aristocracy, chieftains and great landowners whose wergild, the compensatory payment owed to a man's family if he was killed, was substantially higher than that of a free man. Carls were free men, farmers, craftsmen, traders, the broad middle of Norse society who owned land, attended the thing, bore weapons, and had legal standing. Thralls were slaves, captured in raids, born into servitude, or reduced to it through debt, and had no legal standing at all. A thrall's death was a matter for his owner, not for the thing. These distinctions were not merely theoretical. They were material, written into the quality of a man's clothing, the size of his longhouse, the weapons he could carry, and the wergild his family could claim if he died at another man's hand. The price of a free man's life varied by region and period, but it was always calculable, always specific, and always available to be offered as an alternative to the blood feud that would otherwise follow. The blood feud was not the breakdown of the legal system. This is the misunderstanding that the word carries into modern usage, where feud suggests something primitive and lawless. In the Norse world, the feud was itself a legal institution, a structured sequence of possible actions available to the kinsman of a man who had been killed or seriously wronged, governed by rules about who could pursue it, what actions were permissible, and how it could be honorably settled. Killing a man without justification created an obligation for his family to respond, and the response could take several forms. They could accept a wergild payment and declare the matter settled. They could take the case to the thing and seek a legal judgment, or they could pursue the feud directly, which meant that the killing of the original killer, or certain of his close kinsmen, would not itself be counted as a crime requiring compensation. The thing and the feud were not alternatives to each other. They were concurrent mechanisms, and a feud might be interrupted by a thing judgment and resumed if the judgment was not honored, or settled by a thing-mediated negotiation that gave both families something they could accept. The law speaker stood at the center of this system in a way that made his role genuinely unusual in the medieval world. He was elected, not appointed. He served for a term, typically 3 years at the major assemblies, and during that term, his primary obligation was to recite 1/3 of the law each year, so that across his term, the entire code was publicly delivered, and anyone who wished to learn it or check it had the opportunity. His fee was paid in cattle, a material concreteness that grounded his function in the economy of the community rather than in any abstract institutional authority. He had no power to judge, no power to enforce. He had only his memory and the community's willingness to accept that his memory was accurate. The Gulathing, the great regional assembly of Western Norway, was one of the oldest and most developed of these institutions, and its law speaker tradition was long enough that by the time the Viking Age was well underway, the role had accumulated its own customs, its own expectations, and its own kind of authority. The law speaker who misremembered could be corrected publicly by any man who knew the law better, which meant that the men most likely to challenge a law speaker were the men who had made it their business to know the law almost as well as he did, the men who were watching for errors and who would not remain silent if they found one. This public accountability was not a weakness in the system. It was the system's quality control mechanism, and it functioned because the thing was attended by enough people with enough legal knowledge that errors could be caught and named. There is something worth pausing on in the sheer ambition of this arrangement. An entire legal system, the rules governing land tenure, inheritance, wergild, feud, theft, marriage, slavery, debt, and the obligations of chieftains to their followers, held in the memory of one man, recited publicly, and sustained across generations, not by documents, but by the continuous performance of recitation and the continuous vigilance of listeners. Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic scholar who would compile the king's sagas and the mythological texts in the 13th century, drew on a tradition of oral legal knowledge that was already centuries old by his time, and his own work, committed eventually to parchment, was in some sense the point at which this oral system finally allowed itself to be written down without losing the authority that oral performance had given it. The thing also functioned as something beyond a legal assembly. It was a market. Traders arrived when the thing was in session, knowing that the gathering of free men from across a region meant customers for goods that would otherwise require traveling to each farm individually. It was a social event. Marriages were arranged, alliances confirmed, news exchanged from regions too distant for regular contact. It was a political forum where chieftains made their standing visible by the number of followers they brought and the generosity they demonstrated during the assembly. The hazel poles that marked the thing space created a bounded zone in which weapons could not be used. The peace of the thing was a legal condition, and breaking it was a serious crime, because the assembly only functioned if men who hated each other could sit within earshot without killing each other. This prohibition on violence within the thing space was not naive. It was pragmatic. The Norse world was not a peaceful one, and the men who sat at the thing knew this about each other. What the hazel poles accomplished was not the transformation of violent men into peaceful ones, but the creation of a time and a space in which the alternative to violence, the legal settlement, the wergild offer, the mediated compromise, could be offered and considered and sometimes accepted. The thing was a machine for generating alternatives, and it worked well enough that the institution spread wherever Norse settlers went. Iceland's Althing, founded in 930 on the lava plain at Thingvellir, was a direct transplant of this tradition to a new country, carrying with it the law speaker, the hazel poles, the seasonal timing, and the 2-week duration. The relationship between the Thing tradition and the raiding economy is not immediately obvious, but it is real. The same social world that produced the blood feud and the Wergild produced the raid. Both were structured responses to the problem of loss and compensation in a world without a central state to enforce either. A man who had been wronged by a neighbor could pursue the Thing. A chieftain who needed wealth to maintain his following could pursue a raid. The legal vocabulary of obligation and compensation that ran through the Thing system also ran through the economics of raiding. The crew shared the plunder according to agreed rules. The chieftain took his portion, and the distribution was as legally structured as a Wergild payment. This was not coincidence. It was the same culture operating in different registers. Thralls occupied the bottom of this structure with a completeness that left few ambiguities. A thrall owned nothing, decided nothing, and had no recourse against an owner's violence except through the owner's self-interest in preserving a working body. Thralls could be freed, and freed thralls occupied a middle position, legally free but socially marked by their origin, their children sometimes regarded with the same ambivalence. The Viking Age produced thralls in enormous numbers. Captives taken on raids were among the most valuable portable assets a raider could acquire, and the slave trade that ran through the Norse world connected the coasts of Ireland and Britain to the markets of the Frankish towns and, through the eastern river routes, to the slave markets of the Abbasid Caliphate. A healthy adult slave sold on the Volga for a price in silver that represented months of agricultural labor. This was, alongside silver and furs, one of the things that made the raiding economy work. The Thing system did not extend to thralls, but it extended, with some variation, to women of free status, not as voters or law speakers, but as legal persons with defined rights: the right to own property, to initiate divorce under specific circumstances, to bring a legal claim through a male kinsman who acted on her behalf. These rights were narrower than those of free men, but they were real and enforceable, and the Norse legal tradition's recognition of women as persons with legal standing placed it in a somewhat different position from some of its European contemporaries. The legal world of the Thing was already old when the Viking Age began, and it would persist, in modified form, absorbed into the Christian and feudal structures that the age eventually produced, long after the raids had ended. The word Thing itself survived. Tynwald, the Parliament of the Isle of Man, takes its name from it. Dingwall in Scotland carries it. Thingvellir in Iceland is still the site of the national parliament. The hazel poles are gone, and the law speaker no longer stands in the open air reciting the law to free men who have travelled 3 days to hear him. But the institution left its name in the landscape of every place where Norse settlers stopped long enough to hold one, which is itself a kind of record. Chapter 4: Ragnar's Shadow. Ivar the Boneless held York by the winter of 866, and the city had fallen so quickly that the Northumbrians who had retreated from it were still reorganizing when the Danes finished repairing the Roman walls and settled in for the season. The speed of the capture was not accidental. It was the product of a campaign conducted with a strategic coherence that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, composed in Wessex and oriented toward Wessex's survival, only partially records. And that partial record is itself shaped by the discomfort of acknowledging how thoroughly outmaneuvered the northern English kingdoms had been. York fell on the 1st of November, 866, All Saints' Day, when the Northumbrian defenders were occupied with the feast and the Danes moved through a breach in the Roman wall that the city's divided leadership had not repaired. The city's two rival kings, Aela and Osbert, each with a faction, each contesting the other's legitimacy, had not managed to coordinate their forces in time. One of them died in the fighting. The other was captured. What happened to Ulla of Northumbria after his capture is the point at which history and legend become genuinely difficult to separate, and where the figure of Ragnar Lothbrok enters the chronicle as a force rather than as a man. The later Norse sagas, particularly the tale of Ragnar's sons, claim that Ivar and his brothers killed Aella by performing on him the blood eagle, a ritual killing in which the victim's ribs were cut from his spine and his lungs drawn out and spread like wings. Historians have debated for generations whether this practice was historical or literary, whether it was a ritual execution or a saga invention designed to explain why the sons of Ragnar had cause for revenge. The Anglo-Saxon sources record Ella's death without detail. The saga sources record it with elaborate detail that serves the narrative of Ragnar's sons avenging their father. The gap between these two accounts is not resolvable with the evidence available, and the engine notes it as such. What is clear, and what matters more than the details of Ella's death, is the figure whose sons were supposedly avenging him. Ragnar Lothbrok exists in the historical record the way a large ship exists in the wake it leaves. You can see the disturbance in the water without being able to describe the ship with confidence. Something generated the Ragnar tradition, a series of raids on Francia in the 840s associated with a Norse leader named Ragnar, a sack of Paris in 845 that forced the Frankish king Charles the Bald to pay £4,000 of silver to make the raiders leave, a reputation for audacity that accumulated through the middle of the 9th century and attached itself to a name. Whether this Ragnar was a single historical figure, a composite of several, or a legendary construction built around real events is a question the sources cannot answer. The sagas written in Iceland in the 13th century present him as a fully realized character, a king's son, a hero of legendary exploits, the husband of the Volva Aslag who could read fate, the father of sons whose names appear in the historical record with greater reliability than his own. Those sons are where the legend becomes solid. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Uber, Björn Ironside. These names appear in sources close enough to the events they describe to be treated as historical figures rather than saga constructions. Björn Ironside led a famous expedition through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean in 859, raiding along the coasts of what are now Spain, southern France, and North Africa before returning. A voyage so distant that it placed Norse raiders in a world that had no context for them and produced astonished accounts in Arabic sources that had no framework for what they were seeing. Halfdan would become one of the commanders of the great heathen army. Ivar the Boneless would be its strategic mind for the crucial years of its English campaign. The great heathen army arrived in East Anglia in the autumn of 865. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it a Mycel here, a great army, and the word here, meaning an army living off the land it moved through, carried specific legal weight in Anglo-Saxon understanding. It distinguished a raiding force from a settled community, and an army of this scale from the smaller bands that had been working the English coasts for decades. Its size has been debated by historians, with estimates ranging from 2,000 to 5,000 men, which was large for the period, large enough that no single English kingdom could easily meet it in the field, and large enough that it could detach forces in multiple directions simultaneously while maintaining a defensible base. The army's behavior from the moment of its arrival distinguished it from everything that had come before. It did not raid and withdraw. It wintered. In East Anglia, it requisitioned horses, moving quickly to convert itself from a seaborne force into a mobile land army, and it negotiated a peace with the East Anglian king that gave it supplies and freedom of movement in exchange for not ravaging the kingdom immediately. This was not the behavior of men driven purely by appetite for plunder. It was the behavior of an organized military force with strategic objectives and the patience to pursue them across multiple campaigning seasons. The requisition of horses was particularly significant. It meant the army could move at the speed of cavalry rather than infantry, could cover ground that a marching force could not, and could strike and withdraw faster than a response could be organized. Northumbria was the first target for reasons that made strategic sense. It was the northernmost of the major English kingdoms, the furthest from Wessex, the most powerful remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and it was conveniently destabilized by its internal dynastic dispute. Aelle had deposed Osbert. Osbert's supporters remained active, and the political energy that should have been directed outward toward defense was directed inward toward the succession. The Danes understood this, or discovered it quickly enough to exploit it. They moved north from East Anglia in the autumn of 866, reached York before winter, and took it on All Saints' Day through the breach in the Roman wall. York's Roman walls were not a minor asset. The city had been a major Roman administrative centre, Eburacum, the base from which the Emperor Septimius Severus had campaigned and where Constantius Chlorus had died, and its fortifications, though centuries old and partially ruined, were still the most substantial defensive infrastructure in the north of England. The Danes recognized their value immediately. They repaired the walls, garrisoned the city, and converted York from an English ecclesiastical and commercial centre into a Danish military base. The city's population, which had grown back to perhaps 10,000 people under Anglo-Saxon rule, making it one of the larger urban centres in Britain, did not disappear. They remained, and the Danes remained among them, and the process that would eventually produce the hybrid Norse-English culture of what the sources call Jorvik had already begun in the winter of 866. The two Northumbrian kings, Aelle and Osbert, reconciled in the face of the Danish occupation and attempted to retake York in the spring of 867. They breached the wall at a different point from where the Danes had entered, fought their way into the city, and were defeated in the street fighting that followed. Both kings died. Northumbria ceased to function as an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The Danes installed a client king, a Northumbrian named Egbert, who would rule under Danish oversight, and moved on. The army's next target was Mercia. Edmund, king of East Anglia, died in 870 in circumstances that would make him a saint within a generation. The army had circled back to East Anglia after its Mercian campaign, and Edmund, who had maintained his kingdom's peace with the Danes since 865 by giving them what they asked for, refused the terms Ivar reportedly offered, that Edmund share his kingdom and rule under Danish authority. The refusal cost him his life. He was killed, the sources say, in a way that the later hagiographical tradition elaborated into martyrdom, bound to a tree, shot with arrows, then beheaded. His head, according to the legend that accumulated quickly around his death, was thrown into the forest and found by his followers, guarded by a wolf. The wolf surrendered the head when the followers called for it, and then withdrew into the trees. The cult of Saint Edmund grew with extraordinary speed. Within 30 years of his death, his sanctity was being proclaimed on coins minted in the Danelaw, coins produced by Danish authorities, carrying the name of a king they had killed, because his reputation had become commercially useful. This is one of the stranger ironies of the period. The men who killed Edmund ended up participating in the propagation of his cult, because the cult was good for trade and because the Norse settlers of East Anglia were pragmatic enough to incorporate a local saint into their commercial infrastructure. Ragnar himself, if he existed as a coherent individual, if the Paris raid of 845 and the accumulating reputation of the following years belong to one man, is never clearly present in England. The saga tradition places his death there, captured by Ayla and thrown into a snake pit, which produces the motivation for his son's vengeance and the campaign of 865. The historical record places his sons in England with an army and a strategic purpose. Whether the army was assembled to avenge a father or to seize an opportunity that the political fragmentation of the English kingdoms had made obvious is a question the sources answer differently depending on when and where they were written. What the army accomplished is not in dispute. Within 5 years of its arrival in East Anglia, it had destroyed Northumbria as an independent kingdom, extracted concessions from Mercia, and killed the king of East Anglia in a manner that produced a saint. Wessex alone remained, defended by a king who was not yet 20 years old when the army arrived and who would spend the next 15 years in a survival that became, in retrospect, the foundation of English kingship. That king was Alfred, and his encounter with the great heathen army belongs to a later chapter. The shadow that Ragnar cast across all of this was real, whether or not the man himself was. The sons who carried his name into England brought with them a tradition of Norse raiding that had been accumulating for 70 years. The organizational knowledge, the navigational knowledge, the knowledge of which targets were worth striking, and how to hold what they had taken. The great heathen army was not an improvisation. It was the mature expression of a capability that had been building since the longships first appeared off the Northumbrian coast, and it arrived in England with the confidence of people who had spent decades learning what they were doing. Chapter 5. The Ships. A burial mound on a farm in Vestfold, Norway, had been sitting in the landscape for roughly 1,000 years when the farmers working the land in 1880 decided to open it. What they found beneath the clay that had preserved it, clay being the specific condition that made the survival possible, sealing the wood against the oxygen that would otherwise have consumed it, was a ship in almost complete condition, its hull intact to the gunwales, its prow and stern posts present, its internal structure of crossbeams and floor timbers still holding the shape that the shipwrights had given it somewhere around the year 890. The Gokstad ship, as it came to be called after the farm, was not the oldest Norse vessel ever excavated, nor the most elaborately decorated. It was simply the most complete, and its completeness made it the object through which the world eventually understood what a Viking Age longship actually was. Not the horned helmet fantasy that popular illustration had been producing for decades, but a specific engineered solution to a specific set of problems, built by craftsmen who understood wood and water with an intimacy that no written description could fully convey. The man buried in it was never identified. He had been laid in a burial chamber constructed amidships, surrounded by equipment that reflected the assumptions of the Norse afterlife. 12 horses, 6 dogs, a peacock whose presence in Norway implied a trading connection to somewhere considerably further south, 3 smaller boats nested within the larger hull, beds, a tent, kitchen equipment, and the remains of what had been a substantial quantity of food. He was a man of high status. The ship alone made that plain, because a ship of that quality represented an investment of labor and material that only a significant chieftain could command. His bones showed that he had been a large man, probably in his 40s, with the kind of joint damage that accumulates in a life of physical work at sea. He had been ill for some time before his death. Beyond that, the ground kept his name. The ship itself spoke more clearly than the man. Its dimensions, 23 meters long, just over 5 meters at the beam, represented a size that had been reached through generations of incremental refinement, each generation of shipwrights building on what the previous one had learned about how a hull behaved in the water it was designed for. The construction method was clinker-built, planks of oak overlapping along their edges, each plank's lower edge sitting over the upper edge of the plank below it, the overlapping sections riveted together with iron and caulked with tarred animal hair to make them watertight. This produced a hull that was both light and strong, but more importantly, flexible. The Gokstad ship's hull flexed measurably under load, which was not a flaw, but a deliberate property, allowing the hull to absorb the movement of heavy seas rather than resisting them rigidly and eventually breaking. A modern replica of the Gokstad ship sailed across the Atlantic in 1893 by a Norwegian crew, reached speeds of 11 knots under sail, and demonstrated a seakeeping quality that surprised the sailors aboard it. The medieval craftsman who designed it had solved problems that modern naval architects could recognize and admire. 16 pairs of oar holes ran along the hull, covered by small rotating shields when the oars were not in use, which meant the ship could be rowed by 32 men simultaneously, a capability that mattered enormously in the conditions where sails were useless. Calm water, narrow inlets, the approach to a shore where arriving under oar gave the crew control that a vessel dependent on wind could not achieve. The mast was removable, stepped into a fish-shaped block of oak that held it when it was up and released it when it needed to come down, which happened frequently in confined waters or when the ship was being rowed through a space too narrow for the spread of a sail. The single square sail, set on a yard that could be angled to take the wind from a range of directions, gave the ship its deep water capability, the ability to cross the open North Sea, the Norwegian Sea, the North Atlantic itself, in conditions that would have been impassable by oar alone. This combination, oared for coastal work and river navigation, sailed for open water, was the strategic property that made the Norse ships genuinely unlike anything else operating in European waters in the 9th and 10th centuries. A Frankish or English ship of the period was typically built for either coastal work or deep water, not both, and typically required a harbour to operate from, a fixed infrastructure that determined where it could go and how far it could reach. The Norse longship needed no harbour. It could be beached on any gravel shore, pulled above the tide line by its crew, and relaunched the following morning. It could be carried overland between river systems on log rollers when portage was necessary. It could navigate water too shallow for any harbour-dependent vessel. The tactical consequences of this were profound. A Norse fleet could appear anywhere that water reached, which in the geography of Britain, Francia, and the river systems of Eastern Europe was almost everywhere. Running alongside the longship, the warship, the raiding vessel, the ship of chieftains and armies, was a different vessel that did different work. The Nar was broader, deeper, with a higher freeboard and a hold that could carry cargo rather than warriors, perhaps 24 tons of goods, or the equivalent in livestock and settlers and their equipment. The Nar was what carried Ingolf Arnarsson's household to Iceland, what brought Eric the Red's settlers to Greenland, what maintained the supply lines between Norway and the island colonies across the North Atlantic. It was slower than the longship, less maneuverable, not suited for the kind of rapid coastal striking that the longship enabled. But it was the vessel that made settlement possible, that converted the raiding capability of the longship into the colonizing capability that gave the Viking Age its lasting geographic consequences. Navigation on the open ocean presented problems that neither the quality of the hull nor the efficiency of the rig could solve by themselves. The Norse had no magnetic compass. That technology would not reach northern Europe until well into the medieval period, They navigated by the sun, by the stars, by the behavior of birds and marine animals, by the color and temperature of the water, by the direction of the prevailing swell, and by accumulated knowledge of how long a passage to a known destination took under specific wind conditions. The sagas mention a device called the solar steen, the sunstone, which could locate the sun's position through an overcast sky, and experiments with Icelandic spar, a form of calcite crystal with strong polarizing properties, have demonstrated that such a device would have worked with remarkable accuracy. Whether the sunstone of the sagas was Icelandic spar or something else is not established with certainty. That Norse navigators were crossing the open North Atlantic routinely, reaching Iceland and Greenland without the guidance of a compass, is established by the fact that they did it repeatedly enough to maintain settlements there for centuries. The economics of shipbuilding shaped the society that built ships. A longship required oak, and mature oak of the quality needed for the keel and the strakes was not available everywhere in Scandinavia. Some regions imported timber for their shipbuilding, which implied trade networks that predated the raiding economy and continued alongside it. Iron for rivets and tools was produced from bog iron, a widespread but labor-intensive source that required smelting and forging, and the ironwork in a single longship represented a significant proportion of a region's annual iron output. Pine tar for caulking and waterproofing was produced by slow-burning pine roots in earthen kilns, and the smell of it, sharp and resinous, penetrating everything near a working shipyard, was the specific sensory signature of preparation that preceded every sailing season. A ship that was not re-tarred regularly was a ship that was beginning to fail, and the maintenance of a fleet was as labor-intensive as its original construction. A good sword, as noted in the previous chapter, cost the equivalent of a small farm. A longship of the Gokstad type cost considerably more. The labor of skilled craftsmen over months, the timber, the iron, the sale of woven wool that could take 2 or 3 skilled weavers the better part of a year to produce. Only chieftains of substantial means could own longships, which is why longship ownership was itself a marker of status, and why the assembly of a fleet was a political act as much as a military one. A chieftain who could put 10 longships on the water was a chieftain whose reach extended across the sea, and whose ability to project force or establish trade made him someone that other chieftains needed to take seriously. The brynja, the chainmail shirt that protected a well-equipped Norse warrior, was made link by link, each iron ring cut, shaped, and riveted individually. The finished garment containing thousands of rings and representing a year or more of a skilled smith's concentrated labor. Weighing 10 to 12 kilograms when complete, it was warm and heavy and offered genuine protection against cutting weapons, and the men who wore it in a raiding party were visually distinguishable from those who did not. Most Norse fighting men did not wear chainmail. They wore leather, padded garments, whatever protection they could acquire or afford. The chieftain in his brynja, leading men who were armed but largely unarmored, was protected in a way that reinforced his social position even before the fighting began. The ship tied all of this together. It was the object around which a Norse chieftain's economic, military, and social identity organized itself, and the technology of its construction accumulated across the Viking Age rather than remaining static. Ships built in the 11th century were not identical to ships built in the 9th. Keels lengthened, freeboard increased, hulls were adapted to specific routes and specific purposes, and the Norse shipbuilding tradition continued to innovate across the period. By the time the age ended, Norse shipbuilders had been refining their technology for long enough that the vessels they were producing represented the most capable wooden ships in the northern European world, built for a range of purposes: raiding, trading, settling, exploring. That no single ship type fully served, but that the Norse tradition had learnt to address with a family of related vessels adapted to the specific demands of each. The Gokstad ship's replica voyage of 1893 took 28 days to cross from Bergen to Newfoundland. The medieval crew who sailed the original would not have been surprised by the crossing time. They would have been surprised, perhaps, by the destination, by what the land to the west turned out to contain, and by the people it already held. But the voyage itself, the open water and the variable winds, and the long days and the short nights of a North Atlantic summer passage, would have been entirely familiar. They had been doing it for a long time. Chapter 6: Settling the West. In the year 874, a Norse chieftain named Ingolfur Arnason threw the carved pillars of his high seat overboard as his ship approached the Icelandic coast and waited to see where they would wash ashore. This was not impulsiveness interrupting practical judgment. The high seat pillars were consecrated objects, the physical center of a Norse household's domestic authority, the place where the chieftain sat when he rendered decisions and received guests, and their landing point would sanctify the new settlement in a way that a purely pragmatic choice of location could not. To settle where the pillars led was to place the new home under the same divine sanction that had governed the old one. Ingolf's thralls spent 3 years searching the coast before they found the pillars in a bay where steam rose from hot springs along the shore. He named the place Reykjavik, the Smoky Bay. It has been continuously inhabited ever since. He was not the first Norse person to have seen Iceland. A decade or so earlier, a Norwegian named Floki Vilgedarson had led a deliberate exploratory expedition to the island, having navigated partly by releasing ravens and following the direction of their flight, a method that earned him the nickname Hrafna Floki, Raven Floki, in the tradition that remembered him. He wintered on the island's western coast, lost his livestock to the cold, climbed a mountain in spring, and looked north across a fjord still choked with drift ice, and named the place accordingly, Iceland. He returned to Norway with an account that was not encouraging. A man in his party named Thorolf, who had spent the winter eating butter while the livestock starved, reportedly told people back in Norway that the island was so rich that butter dripped from every blade of grass, which is the kind of promotional optimism that tends to attract settlers regardless of its accuracy. Before Floki and before Ingolf, there had been Irish monks. The Norse sources, with a directness that is almost disarming, record that when the first Norse settlers arrived in Iceland, they found Irish hermits already there. Men who had sailed north in their small hide boats seeking the solitude that a remote North Atlantic island could provide, and who departed when the Norse arrived, leaving behind Irish bells and books and staffs that the settlers found in the empty hermitages. These men the Norse called the Papa, the Fathers, and their presence in Iceland before the Norse settlement is corroborated by a reference in the Irish monk Dickiel's geographical treatise of 825, which describes islands in the Northern Ocean inhabited by Irish monks for whom the summer nights were bright enough to pick lice from their shirts at midnight. Iceland's geography fits. The Papa left no lasting settlement, but they left their name in Icelandic place names, Papi, Papafjörður, that are still readable on modern maps. What followed Ingolf's landing was settlement at a speed that had no real parallel in early medieval Europe. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries from oral tradition and earlier written records, names approximately 435 first settlers, each with their family, their household, their thralls, and their livestock. Within 60 years of Ingolf's arrival, virtually every habitable valley on the island was occupied. The settlers came primarily from Norway, driven by the same pressures of land scarcity and political consolidation that were reshaping the Scandinavian homelands. But they came also from the Norse settlements in the British Isles, from the Scottish Islands, from Ireland, from the communities that had established themselves along the western coasts of Britain over the preceding decades. Many brought Irish and Scottish thralls and wives, which means that Iceland's founding population was genetically and culturally mixed from the beginning in ways that the Landnámabók's Norse names partly conceal. Genetic studies of modern Icelanders confirm a founding population that was roughly half Norse in the male line and substantially Celtic, Irish and Scottish in the female line, a distribution that reflects the specific dynamics of Norse settlement in the British Isles before Iceland. Iceland offered something that no other territory available to Norse settlers offered: land with no prior owner to displace, no king to resist, no established power structure to negotiate with. The island was empty of people, setting aside the departing papa, and its resources were extraordinary for a cold country pastoral economy. The coastal waters were thick with fish and seabirds. The interior highlands provided summer grazing for sheep and cattle. The rivers ran with salmon. The geothermal heat that made Reykjavik smoky also provided hot springs that simplified washing and, in some locations, cooking. The forests, low birch woodland covering perhaps a quarter of the island's area at the time of settlement, provided timber and fuel, though the settlers cleared them faster than they regrew. And within a few generations, Iceland was the largely treeless landscape it remains today, a transformation that would create a permanent timber dependency and shape the island's economy for the rest of its history. Among the settlers whose stories the Landnámabók preserves with particular fullness was a woman named Audur, called Orðra, the deep-minded, or in some versions of her name, Unna. She came to Iceland not as a young woman starting over, but as a widow of considerable age and considerable resources, a matriarch who had already lived through the Viking Age's full range of displacement and loss. Her husband had been a Norse king in Dublin. Her son Thorstein had been a warrior leader in Scotland who had been killed in fighting there. After Thorstein's death, Orðra organized the construction of a ship in secret, assembled a household of 20 freemen and an undisclosed number of thralls and dependents, and departed the Scottish Islands for Iceland before any local power could claim authority over her or her resources. She was, by any reckoning, a woman who understood how to act under pressure. She settled in Delir, in the west of Iceland, claiming a large territory and distributing portions of it to her followers, an act of generosity that was also an act of political intelligence, binding men to her through the gift of land in the way that a Norse chieftain bound men through the gift of silver or weapons. She had converted to Christianity in the British Isles, probably in Ireland, where Norse settlers had significant contact with Irish Christian culture, and she practiced her faith quietly in a country that was still predominantly pagan. When she died, she was buried according to her own instructions in a ship, upright, in full dress, on the headland above her farm, facing west toward the sea she had crossed. Her Christian faith and her Norse burial were not, in her understanding, contradictions. The Landnámabók records her death with a respect that is unusual in a text that treats most settlers as names and genealogies. She is described as the most distinguished of all the settlers, and the saga tradition that grew around her life gave her a dignity that the male-dominated narrative of the Viking Age rarely extends to women with such consistency. The Faroe Islands had been settled by Norse people somewhat before Iceland. The evidence suggests Norse presence there from around 800, perhaps earlier. in islands that Irish monks had also reached, and where the monks' sheep had already modified the landscape before the Norse arrived. Orkney and Shetland, closer to the Scottish coast, had been absorbed into the Norse world even earlier. Their existing populations, Pictish in origin, culturally distinct from both the Norse and the mainland Scots, gradually displaced or absorbed as Norse settlers established farms on the best agricultural land, and Norse political authority replaced whatever had existed before. By the time Iceland was being settled, Orkney and Shetland were functioning Norse territories, their earls connected by politics and kinship to Norway, their people speaking Norse, their legal and administrative life organized along Norse lines. They would remain Norse in language and culture for centuries, long after the Viking Age had officially ended. By 930, Iceland had enough population and enough settled territory that its leading men recognized the need for an institution to manage disputes that the local things could not resolve. They chose the model they knew, the Althing. The General Assembly of all Iceland was established at Thingvellir, a natural site on the lava plain east of Reykjavik, where a long cliff face provided a natural acoustic backdrop and a wide flat floor provided space for the thousands of people who would attend. The Althing met each summer for 2 weeks. It adopted the Gulathing's laws, imported from Norway and adapted to Icelandic conditions, and appointed a law speaker to hold and recite them. What it did not do, and what made it genuinely unprecedented, was create a king. Iceland in 930 was the only functioning political entity in the Norse world, possibly in all of Europe, that had no monarch. The men who founded the Althing had left kingdoms behind, many of them specifically because they found the consolidating authority of Harald Fairhair's Norway intolerable, and they built an alternative that distributed power horizontally among the chieftains rather than concentrating it vertically in a single ruler. The chieftains, the Goða, hold a specific legal and religious office, the Goða, which gave them authority over the free men who had chosen to align with them and obligations to those men in return. The Althing was the space where the Goða negotiated with each other, settled disputes through the legal machinery of the Thing system, and collectively managed the business of the country without any single authority capable of overriding the rest. This arrangement worked, imperfectly and sometimes violently, for over 3 centuries. It produced the sagas, those remarkable prose narratives of the settlement generation and its descendants, composed in the 13th century but preserving the memory of the 10th and 11th, a literary tradition that exists nowhere else in the medieval Norse world with anything approaching Iceland's density and quality. It produced the Althing, which still meets at Thingvellir, making it the longest continuously operating parliamentary institution in the world. It also produced, eventually, the political instability that led Iceland to accept Norwegian sovereignty in 1262, when the chieftain system had collapsed into a cycle of violent feuding that the Althing could no longer contain. But that is several centuries ahead. In 930, the Althing at Thingvellir was something new, a country that had decided, consciously and collectively, to govern itself without a king, and that had the institutional machinery to make the attempt. The settlers who came after Ingolf brought with them everything they needed to build a Norse society in a new landscape: the legal traditions of the Thing, the social structures of farm and chieftaincy, the religious practices of the Old Norse faith, the shipbuilding knowledge that had brought them there and would maintain their connection to the wider world. What they could not bring was the timber that Iceland's cleared forests would no longer provide, or the iron that Icelandic geology did not contain, or the grain that the island's climate and soil could not reliably produce. Iceland, from its earliest settled decades, was dependent on trade with Norway for the materials its own landscape withheld, which meant that the North Atlantic crossing that had been an act of settlement became, quickly, a routine of commerce. Ships moving between Iceland and the Norwegian coast carrying Icelandic wool, fish, and falcons in one direction, and Norwegian timber, iron, and grain in the other. That trade route, established in the 9th century and maintained across the Viking Age and long beyond it, was itself a consequence of the ship. The same technology that had carried Ingolfr's high-seat pillars to the shore of Reykjavik kept Iceland alive once it was settled, because an island without iron and without timber is an island that cannot survive in isolation. The Norse world that was opening outward from Scandinavia was not just expanding geographically, it was creating dependencies, connections, and obligations that bound its scattered settlements together across the open water in ways that no single raid had ever required. Chapter 7. The Rivers of the East. The eastern expansion of the Norse world is the part of the Viking Age that sits most uneasily in the popular imagination, partly because it does not fit the template of longships and monastery raids, and partly because the world it moved through, the river systems of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the trading cities of the Abbasid Caliphate, the imperial court of Byzantium, is so far from the North Sea coastline that the connection seems improbable until you trace it on a map and watch it become obvious. The rivers made it possible. The Volga and the Dnieper, with their tributaries and the portage routes between them, formed a connected waterway from the Baltic coast to the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, a distance of several thousand kilometers that Norse traders were navigating by the early 9th century, carrying goods south and returning with silver that was accumulating in Scandinavian hoards faster than any other single source of wealth was producing it. Sweden's geography had always pointed east rather than west. The Swedish coastline faced the Baltic, and the Baltic's eastern shore led to river mouths that led inland, and the interior of the continent, vast, forested, threaded with waterways, held fur-bearing animals in quantities that the Mediterranean world and the Islamic world would pay well for. Beaver pelts, sable, ermine, squirrel. The luxury fur trade that supplied European and Middle Eastern courts and wealthy merchants with the material of high-status clothing ran through the Norse Eastern network as surely as silver ran back along the same routes. Alongside the furs went amber, gathered along the Baltic shores and valued in the south as an ornamental material. Alongside the amber went honey and beeswax, and alongside the honey went something that the sources record with a directness that requires no euphemism: human beings, taken in raids along the Baltic coast and the river settlements, carried south as slaves to be sold in markets along the Volga and beyond. The men who traveled these routes called themselves Varangians, from a Norse word, Varingja, meaning men of the pledge, men bound together by oath. The name distinguished them from the raiders of the Western expansion not by their methods, which overlapped considerably, but by their direction and their primary purpose. The Varangian world was oriented toward trade first, with raiding as a supplement and a fallback when trade was not available or not profitable enough. The silver dirham, the standard coin of the Abbasid Caliphate, was the currency they were seeking, and they found it in quantities that astonish even now. Archaeological excavations across Scandinavia, the Baltic Islands, and the Norse settlement zones have recovered hoards containing hundreds of thousands of Arabic dirhams, the physical record of a trade that moved more silver into the Norse world than any other single source. A single hoard found on the Swedish island of Gotland, itself a major node in the Baltic trading network, contained over 67,000 silver coins and coin fragments, the accumulated savings of a merchant or a merchant family buried against some anticipated emergency that never permitted retrieval. The Volga route ran from the Gulf of Finland south through Lake Ladoga and the river systems beyond it, eventually reaching the Volga itself and following it south to the Caspian Sea, where the trading cities of the Volga Bulgars and, beyond them, the cities of the Khazar Khaganate provided markets and transit points for goods moving between the Norse north and the Islamic south. The Dnieper route ran a different course, south through what is now Ukraine to the Black Sea and Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world and a market for goods of every description. Both routes required portage between river systems at specific points, which meant hauling the ship and its cargo overland on log rollers across distances that could run to several kilometers, a laborious operation that shaped which ships worked on the eastern routes. Smaller, lighter vessels than the deep-water longship, sized for river navigation and capable of being manhandled between watersheds. Into this world, in the autumn of 921, came a man named Amhad ibn Fadlan, an official in the service of the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir in Baghdad, dispatched as part of a diplomatic mission to the king of the Volga Bulgars. Ibn Fadlan was not a traveler by temperament. He was a legal and religious official, sent to deliver a letter and a gift and to provide religious instruction to the newly Muslim Bulgar court, and his account of the journey, which survives in a manuscript discovered only in 1923, has the quality of a man recording what he sees with the precision of someone who cannot quite believe what he is looking at. He was meticulous, occasionally horrified, and consistently accurate in ways that archaeology has subsequently confirmed, which makes his account one of the most valuable single documents in the history of the Viking Age. He encountered the Rus, the Norse traders and settlers operating along the Volga, at a trading post near the Bulgar court, and his description of them is worth dwelling on because it is the most detailed external account of Norse people in the Viking Age that survives from a non-Christian perspective. He found them tall, fair, and tattooed from the fingernails to the neck with dark blue or dark green patterns of trees and figures, a description that has no Norse parallel in the written record, but that fits the evidence of certain archaeological finds. He found them dirty by his standards and fastidiously clean by their own, which turned out to mean something different from what he expected. They washed their faces and hands each morning in a communal basin passed around the group, which struck Ibn Fadlan as thoroughly unsanitary, while their regular bathing in the steam bath, which he does not record observing, would have struck him as excessive by Arab standards of hygiene. The encounter between his framework and their practices produced a description dense with misunderstanding that is, precisely because of the misunderstanding, extraordinarily vivid. He witnessed a ship funeral. A man of some standing among the Rus had died, and the community along the Volga was preparing to send him out in the manner that the Norse used for important dead: a ship, goods, and the sacrifice of a slave woman who had volunteered or been selected. The sources are ambiguous on the precise nature of the choice to accompany her master. Ibn Fadlan recorded the preparation over 10 days with the attention of a man who found the proceedings somewhere between fascinating and appalling, and the account he produced is the only contemporaneous external description of a Norse ship burial by an eyewitness. The dead man was laid in the ship with his weapons, his food, strong drink, musical instruments, and the woman who would accompany him. The ship was hauled onto a wooden framework above the ground. The woman was killed. Ibn Fadlan records the method and laid beside the man. The ship was then set alight by the dead man's nearest male relative, who approached the pyre walking backward, naked, with one hand covering his anus. a ritual posture that Ibn Fadlan recorded without explanation because he apparently received none. An old woman whom the Rus called the Angel of Death directed the proceedings throughout. When the fire had consumed the ship, a mound was raised over the ashes, and a post of white birch wood was planted at its center with the dead man's name and the name of the Rus king written on it. Ibn Fadlan does not record whether the writing was in runes or in Arabic, but the detail of writing on the post implies literacy of some kind. Either the Rus had acquired enough familiarity with Arabic script to use it, or they were using runic letters in a context where Ibn Fadlan saw marks he took for writing without recognizing their origin. A man standing near Ibn Fadlan during the burning, who could speak Arabic, told him that the Norse buried their dead in the earth in other places, where the worms and the cold consumed them, whereas here the fire took a man in a moment and sent him straight to paradise. Ibn Fadlan records this explanation without endorsing it, but he records it with the care of a man who understood he was witnessing something that deserved to be described exactly. Rurik, whose name appears in the Russian primary chronicle as the Varangian chieftain invited to rule at Novgorod in 859, is the figure around whom the founding of the Russian state has traditionally been organized. The Chronicles account that the people of Novgorod, exhausted by their own internal feuding, sent an invitation to the Varangian Rus, asking them to come and rule, reflects a pattern that appears elsewhere in the Norse world, the conversion of a military and commercial presence into a political one, the Norse establishing not just a trading post, but a dynasty. Whether Rurik was invited or installed himself by force, whether the Novgorod account reflects a genuine historical event or a later political myth designed to legitimate the Rurikid dynasty by making its origins consensual, is a question that historians of Russia and Scandinavia have argued about for 2 centuries without resolution. What is not in dispute is that the Rurikid dynasty, founded in the 9th century, was real and consequential beyond almost any other political consequence of the Viking Age. Oleg of Novgorod, who succeeded Rurik and extended the dynasty's control south to Kiev, making Kiev the capital of what became known as Kievan Rus, signed commercial treaties with Byzantium in 907 and 911 that are among the earliest surviving diplomatic documents involving Norse people. The treaties regulated the conditions under which Rus merchants could trade in Constantinople, specifying where they could stay, how many could enter the city at once, that they could not carry weapons inside the city walls, and what taxes they would pay. These are the details of a commercial relationship mature enough to need legal regulation, which means that by 907, the Dnieper trade route to Constantinople was already substantial enough that both parties found it worth the trouble of a formal agreement. The Varangian Guard, the elite military unit of the Byzantine emperor drawn from Norse and later Norse-descended warriors, emerged from this connection between the Norse world and Constantinople. Norse mercenaries had been serving in Byzantine armies since at least the 870s, and by the early 11th century the Guard had become a formalized institution, the emperor's personal bodyguard, armed with axes rather than swords, known and feared throughout the Byzantine world for the quality of their fighting and the enthusiasm of their drinking. Harald Hardrada, who would later be the last Norse claimant to the English throne, served in the Varangian Guard in the 1030s and 1040s, fighting across the Mediterranean and accumulating the wealth and reputation that would eventually support his Norwegian kingship. The Guard's roster across its history reads like a summary of Norse political misfortune. Men who had lost kingdoms or positions at home came to Constantinople and found employment suited to their skills, and the city absorbed them and used them, and occasionally promoted them to positions of genuine influence in the Byzantine court. The silver that came back through these eastern networks entered the Norse world as currency, but also as ornament. The dirhams were cut and weighed as bullion, melted and reworked into arm rings and neck rings, and the elaborate silver jewelry that Norse craftsmen produced with exceptional skill. Some were kept intact as coins, buried in hoards against need. The scale of the Eastern silver trade changed the material texture of the Norse world in ways that went beyond economics. A society that had measured wealth in cattle and land and ships found itself with access to portable, divisible, internationally recognized value in quantities that accelerated everything: the ability to equip armies, to buy loyalty, to settle debts at long range, to build the kind of political structures that required financial resources as well as personal authority. The rivers of the East ran for a long time. The Varangian routes remained active through the 10th century and into the 11th, their character shifting as the Norse settlers along them merged with the Slavic populations of the river towns and eventually produced the culture that would become Russia and Ukraine. The Norse language along the eastern routes faded within a few generations, unlike in Iceland or the Danelaw, where Norse persisted for centuries. The Eastern Norse were a thin layer over a large Slavic base and were linguistically absorbed relatively quickly. What remained, embedded in the political structures and the trade networks and the genetic record of the populations along the Volga and the Dnieper, was the consequence of what they had done, moving south in their shallow riverboats with their furs and their amber and their silver scales, finding a connected world that stretched from the Baltic to Baghdad and making themselves, for a century and more, its necessary intermediaries. Chapter 8: The Danelaw. Customary law is the most conservative of all human institutions. It changes slowly, grudgingly, under sustained pressure, and it carries within its provisions the memory of the social arrangements that produced it, the assumptions about land, family, obligation, and authority that a community has lived inside long enough to stop noticing. When the Danes settled the eastern and northern regions of England in the decades following the Great Heathen Army's campaigns, they brought their own customary law with them, and that law settled into the English landscape with the same stubbornness that customary law always displays. The region where Danish legal custom operated alongside or in place of Anglo-Saxon equivalents came to be known, in the sources that eventually described it, as the Danelaw. Not a kingdom, not a formally bounded administrative unit, but a zone of legal difference running roughly from the Thames estuary north and east to the Tees, within which inheritance passed differently. Land was measured differently, administrative units bore different names, and the courts that settled disputes applied different rules from those in use a day's ride to the west. This legal difference was the most durable consequence of the settlement, more durable than the political control that produced it, and more durable than the Norse language that accompanied it. The administrative unit, called the wapentake, from the Norse vapnatak, the taking up of weapons as a gesture of assent at an assembly, replaced the Anglo-Saxon hundred across much of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, and remained in official use in those counties until the 19th century. The word riding, as in the North Riding and East Riding of Yorkshire, comes from the Norse thridjunga, meaning a third part, the administrative division of a large territory. These were not decorative survivals. They were the operational vocabulary of local government, used by clerks and courts and tax collectors for centuries after the last Danish king had ceased to rule in England, because the administrative machinery installed during the Danelaw period simply continued to function after the political authority that created it had been replaced. Alfred of Wessex was 22 years old when the Great Heathen Army arrived in England in 8065, and he was not yet king. His three older brothers held the throne in succession through the years of the army's campaigns in Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. and Alfred fought in those campaigns as a subordinate commander, accumulating military experience under conditions that were rarely favorable to the English side. By the time he became King of Wessex in 8071, the army had already been in England for 6 years, had destroyed Northumbrian independence, had extracted tribute from Mercia, and had killed Edmund of East Anglia. Wessex was the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom intact, and it was intact only in the sense that it had not yet been conquered. It had already paid tribute to the army and fought several engagements against it without decisive result. The winter of 877 to 878 was Alfred's worst. A Danish force under Guthrum, one of the army's senior commanders, a figure who had been managing the Danish position in southern England for several years, launched a surprise attack on Alfred's royal estate at Chippenham in January, at a moment when such an attack was least expected. Alfred escaped, apparently with very little warning and very few men, and withdrew into the Somerset marshes, taking refuge at a place called Athelney, a low island in the wetlands that was defensible precisely because it was difficult to reach. The story of Alfred hiding in a peasant woman's cottage and burning her cakes while distracted by the weight of his situation is the most famous of the stories that accumulated around this period of his life, and it is almost certainly a later legend rather than a historical record. What is not legendary is the fact of the retreat. The king of the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom spent the winter of 878 as a fugitive in his own country, with Danish forces in control of the royal centre and most of Wessex effectively under occupation. He did not remain there long. Through the spring of 878, Alfred used the Somerset marshes as a base from which to conduct guerrilla operations against the Danish position, maintaining contact with the loyal men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, rebuilding a force from the remnants of his household troops and the men who came to him in the wetlands. In May, he emerged from Athelney, called the Fyrd, the levy of free men with an obligation to military service, and at Eddington in Wiltshire met Guthrum's army in a pitched battle that lasted through the day and ended with the Danes breaking and retreating to their fortified camp at Chippenham, where Alfred besieged them for 2 weeks until they surrendered. The terms Alfred imposed were specific and revealing. Guthrum would leave Wessex. He would accept Christian baptism. He would be received into the Christian community, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather, which created between them a spiritual relationship that carried real obligations on both sides. The godfather responsible for the spiritual welfare of the baptized, the newly baptized bound to the godfather by a tie that Christian law treated as nearly equivalent to blood. The ceremony took place at Aller, a village in Somerset near Athelney, and Guthrum received the Christian name Aethelstan, an impeccably Anglo-Saxon name, a king's name, the name of a figure who belonged in the world Alfred was trying to sustain. For 12 days after the baptism, Guthrum wore the white baptismal garment, the chrism cloth, according to the custom of the period, and Alfred gave him gifts throughout, the material generosity of a lord receiving a client. What Alfred had done at Aller was convert a military victory into a political settlement through the machinery of Christian ritual. Guthrum as Aethelstan was not the same political problem as Guthrum the pagan. He was now a Christian king with Christian obligations, embedded in a network of spiritual kinship with the King of Wessex, ruling Danish-held territory under a name that signaled accommodation with the Anglo-Saxon world rather than conquest of it. Whether Alfred believed that the baptism had genuinely transformed Guthrum, or whether he understood it primarily as a political instrument, the Treaty of Wedmore that followed the baptism gave the settlement legal structure. A boundary was established between Alfred's territory and the Danish-held lands, and both sides agreed to observe it. The boundary was not perfectly stable. It was renegotiated and adjusted across the following decades as Alfred's successors pushed it gradually north and east. But its establishment created something that had not existed before: a formal acknowledgement that England was divided between two legal and cultural worlds, and that the division could be managed through negotiation rather than through continuous war. The Danelaw was not Alfred's creation in the sense that he designed it. It was the settlement that emerged from the collision between the Danish military position and Alfred's stubborn refusal to be eliminated, and the treaty that recognized it was the instrument through which both sides agreed to stop trying to destroy each other, at least for the time being. York under Danish rule had become something that the Anglo-Saxon city had not been: a major commercial centre with international connections. The Danes called it Jorvik, a Norse adaptation of the Roman and Anglo-Saxon name, and under their administration it grew into one of the most economically active cities in Britain. Its population at the height of Danish power has been estimated at around 10,000 people, large by the standards of the period, and its commercial district, centered on the street now called Coppergate, produced an archaeological record of extraordinary richness when it was excavated in the late 1970s. The excavators found leather workers, amber carvers, metal workers, comb makers working in antler, weavers, coopers, and the physical traces of a trading economy that connected York to Dublin, to Scandinavia, to the Rhineland, and to the Byzantine world through the long chains of exchange that the Norse networks had made possible. Silk fragments from Byzantium, amber from the Baltic, walrus ivory from the North Atlantic, all of it moving through a city that had been, before the Danes arrived, an important ecclesiastical centre with a famous school, and that had become, under Danish rule, something with considerably more economic diversity. The Coppergate excavation also found the everyday material of Norse life in England with a completeness that written sources cannot provide: the shoes, the gaming pieces, the combs, the pins, the food remains that told archaeologists what people in Jorvik were eating: cattle, sheep, pig, fish, shellfish, wild birds, hazelnuts, sloe berries, and the structural remains of the buildings in which they were eating it: post and wattle structures organized along a street frontage in a pattern more Norse than Anglo-Saxon in its organization. The Jorvik Viking Centre, built on the excavation site, allows visitors to walk through a reconstruction of the Coppergate Street as it stood around 975, which makes it one of the rare places in Britain where the physical texture of the Viking Age is accessible as something more than a display case of metal objects. The Danish settlers who made this city brought their language with them, and it settled into the English spoken around them with a thoroughness that has no real parallel in the history of English. Old Norse and Old English were related languages, both descended from Germanic, both sharing enough vocabulary and grammatical structure that speakers of one could manage a rough comprehension of the other, which meant that the linguistic mixing in the Danelaw was not the collision of entirely foreign systems, but something more like the mutual adjustment of dialects. Words passed between them with less resistance than they would have faced between truly unrelated languages. The Norse words that entered English through the Danelaw were not prestige borrowings from a conqueror's tongue, of the kind that French would later produce after the Norman conquest. They were the words of neighbours who needed to talk to each other, everyday nouns and verbs and adjectives that filled gaps or replaced Anglo-Saxon equivalents with forms that evidently felt easier or more natural to the mixed communities of the Danelaw. Sky replaced the Anglo-Saxon huffon in most contexts. Window, vindaga, windeye, replaced the Anglo-Saxon term for an opening in a wall. Husband, knife, egg, bag, ugly, awkward, ill, weak, loose, flat, odd, wrong, all Norse. all embedded so deeply in ordinary English that they became invisible as borrowings within a few generations of their adoption. The ecclesiastical life of the Danelaw was more complex than the political narrative suggests. The Danish settlers were pagan when they arrived, but the process of conversion in the Danelaw was faster and less contested than the formal conversion campaigns in Scandinavia would later be, partly because the Norse settlers in England were a minority living among a Christian majority, partly because the economic and social advantages of Christian affiliation in an English context were immediate and practical, and partly because the Christian church in the Danelaw continued to function throughout the period of Danish political control, providing the administrative and spiritual infrastructure that the settlers found it easier to join than to replace. The coins minted in the Danelaw in the name of Saint Edmund, produced by Danish authorities within 30 years of Edmund's death at Danish hands, are the most visible evidence of this pragmatic accommodation. Danish moneyers, working within a Danish political system, producing coins that carried the name of a Christian saint because that name was commercially valuable in the mixed market of the Danelaw. Archbishop Wulfhere of York, who had fled the city when the Danes took it in 866, eventually returned and continued to function as an ecclesiastical administrator under Danish political authority, a compromise that required something from both sides and that the sources record without evident discomfort, because the alternative, which was the complete collapse of ecclesiastical organization in the north of England, was worse for everyone, including the Danes. The church provided literacy, record-keeping, and the legitimating vocabulary of authority that even a Danish king found useful. And so the church continued, adapted, and absorbed the new political reality with the institutional resilience that the church consistently demonstrated when confronted with political change it could not prevent. Chapter 9. Harald's Kingdom. Harald Fairhair made a vow, according to the saga tradition that preserved his memory, that he would not cut or comb his hair until he had brought all of Norway under his rule. The sagas record that his hair in the years of the campaign was thick and wild, which earned him the nickname Lufa, the mop, before the victories came and the grooming resumed and the epithet shifted to something more flattering. This is almost certainly a literary detail rather than a historical one, the kind of organizing image that saga writers use to give a long campaign a memorable shape. But it carries a truth that the more sober historical record confirms. The unification of Norway was a prolonged, violent, and genuinely uncertain process, and the man who accomplished it understood that accomplishing it required not just military superiority, but the patience to pursue a goal across years of resistance from men who had ruled their own territories for generations and saw no reason to stop. What Harald was doing in the latter half of the 9th century had no real precedent in the Norse world. The Scandinavian political landscape was one of distributed power. Chieftains, petty kings, regional lords who held authority over specific fjords and valleys and coastal strips, each with his own following, his own ships, and his own claim to the loyalty of the men around him. Some of these regional powers had been stable across several generations. Others were contested and shifting. None of them had faced the particular challenge that Harald represented, a neighbor who was not merely raiding or competing for resources, but who was systematically absorbing their territories into a larger political unit and offering them, as an alternative to submission, destruction. The chieftains and petty kings of Norway had dealt with rivals before. They had not dealt with a unifier. The campaigns that preceded the Battle of Hafrsfjord took Harald across the length of the Norwegian coastal landscape, north to Hålogaland, south through Vestland, east into the inland territories, and each campaign extended his network of alliances and subordinate rulers, while reducing the number of independent powers capable of resisting him. His method was not purely military. Marriage alliances were a significant tool. Harald had, by the saga tradition's accounting, somewhere between 9 and 20 wives across his life, a number that reflects the political function of marriage in the Norse world rather than personal preference. Each union connecting Harald's household to another chieftaincy and converting a potential rival into a kinsman with obligations of loyalty. The saga tradition presents Ragnhild, a Danish princess, as the principal wife whose ambitions helped drive the unification project, though the historical details of Harald's domestic arrangements are too obscured by later literary shaping to treat as reliable biography. Hafrsfjord, the decisive engagement, was fought at sea. The geography of Norway made naval battle the natural form of decisive confrontation between powers whose military strength was organized around ships and whose territories were separated by water as often as by land. A fleet engagement in a fjord was a set-piece battle of a specific kind. Ships lashed together in lines, men fighting across the decks of adjacent vessels. The battle decided when one side's line broke and the survivors escaped by water or surrendered on the spot. Harald's fleet met the combined forces of a coalition of Western Norwegian chieftains who had recognized that his campaign, if allowed to continue, would eventually reach them, and who had assembled their ships and their men in the fjord near what is now Stavanger to stop him. The coalition was real and substantial. This was not a minor engagement against a minor opponent, and the fact that Harald won it decisively enough to end organized resistance to his rule in Norway suggests that his military and organizational capability by this point was genuinely superior to anything the coalition could assemble. The date of Hafrsfjord is uncertain. The sagas place it around 872, but modern scholarship has argued for dates as late as 8085. And the evidence does not permit a confident resolution. What is clear is that after Hafrsfjord, the political landscape of Norway had changed permanently. Harald was king in a sense that none of his predecessors had been. King not of a region or a dynasty's traditional territory, but of Norway as a geographic and political entity, with subordinate jarls administering the regions he had absorbed and owing him a loyalty backed by the military reality that resistance had been tried and had failed. Among those who found this new reality intolerable were the men and families who chose emigration over submission. The saga tradition presents Harald's unification as a direct driver of Icelandic settlement, and while this is probably an oversimplification, the pressures driving Norse emigration were multiple and predated Harald. It is not simply wrong. The generation of Icelandic settlers included men who had been on the losing side at Hafrsfjord, or who had held regional power in Norway that Harald's consolidation had eliminated, and Iceland received them as a place where Norwegian political authority did not reach, and where a chieftain without a kingdom could build something new. The connection between Harald's Norway and Iceland's founding generation was real enough that the Landnámabók traces numerous settler genealogies back to men who had been powerful in Norway before the unification and who left afterward. Harald's kingdom did not remain stable in the form he created it. He had too many sons. The sagas give him somewhere between 11 and 20 by various wives and concubines, and Norse inheritance custom did not concentrate succession in a single heir, but distributed it, with the result that Harald's death set his sons competing for the territory he had unified, fragmenting it almost immediately into the regional conflicts that his campaigns had temporarily suppressed. Håkon the Good, his youngest son, who had been fostered at the English court of Athelstan and returned as a Christian king, eventually reunified much of Norway, but the pattern of unification, followed by fragmentation, followed by partial reunification, would recur across the following century, because the political will to hold Norway together as a unit was not always matched by the military and administrative capacity to enforce it. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the North Sea, A Norse chieftain named Gungu Hrolf was doing something different with the political problem that Harald's consolidation had produced. Hrolf, known to history by the Frankish rendering of his name, Rollo, had been operating along the Seine Valley for years, leading a force of Norse raiders who had made the lower Seine their operational territory and who had demonstrated, repeatedly, that the Frankish kingdom could not dislodge them. The Franks had been dealing with Norse raiders on the Seine since the 840s, when the raid that the sources associate with Ragnar had sacked Paris and extracted 4,000 pounds of silver from Charles the Bald. The river gave Norse forces something the open coast did not: a road into the interior, past the coastal defences that Frankish kings were slowly developing, reaching the wealthy agricultural heartland of the Frankish kingdom, where monasteries and estates held the accumulated wealth of centuries. Rollo's size is one of the details the saga tradition preserves with the kind of specificity that suggests it attached itself to him early and was not easily displaced by later invention. No horse could carry him, the sagas say, and so he walked. Whether or not this is literally true, it functioned as a characterizing detail that the tradition found useful, and it gives him a physical presence in the imagination that most Norse figures from this period lack. He was, by any account that survives, a man of unusual force, not a raider content with seasonal plunder, but a leader capable of maintaining a coherent force in the field across years of campaigning and of negotiating a permanent political settlement when the opportunity arose. The opportunity arose because Charles the Simple, the Frankish king who found himself dealing with Rollo's persistent presence in the lower Seine, reached the conclusion that the cost of continuing to fight was higher than the cost of accommodating the Norse presence within a legal framework that converted raider into vassal. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, negotiated in 911, gave Rollo and his followers the lower Seine territories, the region centered on Rouen, with access to the sea, in exchange for Rollo's homage to Charles, his acceptance of Christian baptism, and his commitment to defend the coast against other Norse raiders. Charles was, in effect, hiring Rollo to do what his own military had failed to do: keep Norse ships off the lower Seine. Rollo was receiving something he had not been able to secure by force alone: legal title to the territory he occupied, recognized by the sovereign authority of the Frankish kingdom, and therefore legitimate in the eyes of the wider European world. The ceremony of homage at St. Clair-sur-Epte was, by the account that the chronicler Dudo of St. Quentin recorded a century later, eventful. Homage required the vassal to kneel before his lord and place his hands within the lord's hands, a gesture of subordination that Rollo, by the account, declined to perform himself. One of his men performed the act on his behalf, but when required to kiss the king's foot as part of the ceremony, lifted Charles's foot to his own mouth rather than bending down, which tipped the king backward off his throne and produced what the chronicler describes as great laughter among the assembled Franks. Whether this story is history or anecdote shaped by later Norse pride in Rollo's unbending character is impossible to determine. What it preserves is a truth about the political situation at St. Clair. Rollo was not a defeated enemy accepting terms from a victor. He was a power accepting a framework that suited him, and the terms of the framework reflected that reality. The territory Rollo received became, within a generation, the Duchy of Normandy. His followers, Norse in origin and Norse in military culture, absorbed the French language and the Christian faith with a speed that surprised contemporaries and has puzzled historians ever since. Within 2 generations, Old Norse was no longer spoken in Normandy, and the Normans were culturally French in all the ways that mattered for their integration into the Frankish political world. What they retained, and what made them formidable in the 11th century when they began expanding outward from Normandy into England and southern Italy and eventually the Crusader states, was their military organization and their administrative sophistications. The Norse capacity for organizing violence and the Frankish capacity for administering territory combined in a single aristocratic culture that was more capable than either of its parent traditions had been alone. Rollo's great-great-great-grandson would stand at Hastings in 1066 and win England. The line between Rollo kneeling or not kneeling at St. Clair-sur-Epte and William the Conqueror receiving the English crown runs straight, if one follows it through 5 generations of Normans who had converted their Norse raiding culture into something that the medieval world found entirely legible as legitimate aristocratic power. This is the long consequence of 991, not the immediate settlement of the Lower Seine, but the transformation of Norse military energy into a European dynastic force that would reshape the political landscape of the 11th century in ways that no one at St. Clair could have anticipated, and that make the treaty, in retrospect, one of the more consequential agreements of the medieval world. Harold's kingdom, Rollo's duchy, 2 different answers to the same question, which was what to do with Norse military power once the raiding economy had produced enough wealth and organizational experience to make something more permanent possible. Harold built a kingdom that held together as long as his personal authority sustained it and fragmented when he died. Rollo built a territory that absorbed itself into an existing political framework and emerged, a century and a half later, as one of the most dynamic military powers in Europe. Neither answer was obviously superior at the time. History, with its usual disregard for the expectations of the people living through it, made the second one considerably more consequential. Chapter 10. The world turned Christian. The Old Norse religion had no name for itself. This is not a trivial observation. A religious tradition that has no name for itself as a tradition is one that has not yet been forced to define its edges, that exists not as a system consciously held against alternatives, but as the natural texture of the world, the way things are done, the stories that explain what the gods want and what the dead require and what the seasons mean. The Norse called their gods the Aesir and the Vanir. They called specific practices by specific names. What they did not have was a word for the totality of those practices as a religion, as a thing that could be chosen or rejected, adopted or abandoned. That word, the concept it represents, arrived with Christianity, because Christianity was a religion that knew it was a religion, that had a theology and a clergy and a text and an institution, and that understood other religious traditions as things to be replaced rather than coexisted with. The encounter between the two was not, in this sense, a contest between equals. It was a contest between an organized system with a clear agenda and a diffuse tradition that had never needed an agenda because it had never faced a serious alternative. Norse paganism was local and flexible in ways that made it resilient in some circumstances and vulnerable in others. There was no central temple, no priestly hierarchy with authority across regions, no orthodoxy that could be defended by institutional means. Each community maintained its own relationship with its own gods through its own rituals, adjusted to local custom and local need. A chieftain who had a particular devotion to Odin did not thereby require his followers to abandon Thor. A household that propitiated the Landvetter, the land spirits that inhabited specific fields and streams and outcroppings, did so alongside whatever larger cult practices the community observed, without contradiction. This flexibility made Norse paganism comfortable to live inside and very difficult to defend against a tradition that insisted on exclusive allegiance. Haakon the Good was the first Norwegian king to attempt a Christian conversion of his kingdom, and his failure is instructive. Haakon had been fostered as a child at the court of Aethelstan of England, the grandson of Alfred the Great and the first king to style himself King of all England, and had received a Christian education there that he retained as a genuine personal conviction rather than a political affiliation. When he returned to Norway in the 930s to claim the kingship from his brother Eirik Bloodaxe, he brought his faith with him and attempted, carefully at first and then more directly, to introduce it to his kingdom. His nobles resisted. They were willing to accept a Christian king who did not press the matter, but they were not willing to abandon the sacrificial feasts, the bloat, that organized the religious and social calendar of Norse life. And when Haakon attended the great midwinter feast at Lade and was pressed by his chieftains to participate in the ritual drinking and the sacrificial rites, he compromised rather than confronted. He made the sign of the cross over his drinking horn. His chieftains, after negotiation, accepted this as a Thor's hammer sign, and the feast proceeded. The religion that Haakon died in did not survive him in any organized form in Norway, because the infrastructure, the churches, the clergy, the parish system that would have embedded it in daily life was not built. A king's personal faith, without institutional support, did not transfer to his kingdom. The political logic of conversion becomes clearer when set against the map of 10th century Europe. By the middle of the 10th century, the Frankish kingdoms, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, the kingdoms of the Slavic world, and the Byzantine Empire were all Christian. The remaining pagan territories in northern and eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the Baltic peoples, parts of Poland and Hungary, were the edges of a Christian world that was expanding inward from every direction simultaneously. A pagan Norse king trading with Christian England, Christian Francia, and the Christian Rhineland operated in a world where his paganism marked him as an outsider in every diplomatic context, where the church's networks of communication and legitimation were closed to him, and where the intellectual and administrative tools that literacy provided, tools the church controlled, were unavailable to his government. The incentive to convert was not merely spiritual, it was the incentive of access, to trade networks, to diplomatic recognition, to the administrative capacity that a literate Christian clergy could provide to a king who needed records kept and letters written and laws codified. Olaf Tryggvason understood this with a clarity that his predecessor Haakon had not fully acted on, and he drew the conclusion that Haakon's gentle approach had failed and that a different method was required. Olaf had come to power in Norway in 995 after years as a Viking raider in the British Isles. He had participated in the raids on England that were extracting enormous quantities of silver from Athelred's kingdom through the Danegeld, and his own conversion had taken place in the Scilly Isles, where a hermit he encountered reportedly predicted his future kingship with enough precision that Olaf took the prediction and the faith that produced it seriously. He arrived in Norway already baptized, already committed, and with the conviction of a man who had found his faith through personal experience rather than political calculation, though the political calculation was also present and was not ignored. His methods were direct. The great temple complex at Lade, near Trondheim, which had been the ceremonial center of Norwegian paganism under the Earls of Lade, who had effectively controlled much of Norway before Olaf's rise, was dismantled. Cult objects were destroyed or confiscated. Chieftains and landowners who refused baptism faced consequences that ranged from the loss of property to the loss of life, depending on the prominence of their resistance and Olaf's assessment of how much force the situation required. A missionary named Thangbrand was sent to Iceland and conducted his mission with an enthusiasm that extended to killing 2 men who composed satirical verses about him, which did not recommend Christianity to the Icelanders and resulted in Thangbrand's expulsion, though not before he had made converts among several of the island's leading families. Olaf's reign was too short for the institutional work of conversion. He died at the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000, defeated by a coalition that included the kings of Denmark and Sweden and the powerful earls of Lad who had never accepted his authority. But the momentum he created did not die with him. The Althing of 999 or 1000. The sources give both dates and the precise year remains uncertain, was the moment at which Iceland decided its religion by the machinery of its own political system, which was itself a remarkable event with no real parallel elsewhere in the Christian conversion of the North. The circumstances were political before they were spiritual. Olaf Tryggvason had been pressing the Icelanders, through the Icelandic Christians at his court and through the threat of reprisals against Icelandic merchants in Norway, to adopt Christianity as a country. The Icelandic chieftains who arrived at Thingvellir for the summer assembly were divided. Some had already converted, some were committed pagans, and a substantial middle was weighing the political calculation with the care that the Althing's tradition of deliberative politics encouraged. The division at the Althing became acute enough that the Christian and pagan factions each declared their own separate law, which was a constitutional crisis. The Althing's function depended on a single law that everyone accepted, and 2 factions declaring incompatible legal systems threatened to dissolve the institution that held Iceland together as a political entity. The crisis was resolved by referring the question to the law speaker, Þjóðir Ljósvetninga Godi, a man who was himself pagan and who therefore had no obvious personal interest in the outcome that the Christians would have preferred. Both sides agreed to accept whatever judgment Þjóðir delivered, which was itself an act of institutional trust that says something about the respect his office commanded. Þjóðir took his cloak, lay down, and pulled it over himself. He lay in silence for a full day and night while the assembly waited. What he was doing under the cloak, whether he was deliberating, meditating, sleeping, or performing some ritual act that the sources do not explain, is not recorded, because no one asked him afterward, or if they did, his answer was not preserved. He emerged, called the assembly to order, and declared that Iceland would have one law and one faith, and that faith would be Christianity. His reasoning, as the sources record it, was practical rather than theological. A country divided between 2 incompatible legal systems would tear itself apart, and the unity of the law required the unity of the religion that the law was now asked to serve. He added 2 significant concessions to the pagan faction: the exposure of infants, which Christian doctrine forbade but which Norse custom permitted in cases of hardship, would be allowed to continue privately, and the eating of horse flesh, which was associated with pagan ritual, would also be permitted in private. Christianity would govern the public law. Certain pagan accommodations would survive in the domestic sphere, out of official sight. Þjóðir then went home to his farm, took the figures of the gods he had kept in his household, and threw them into a waterfall near his property. The waterfall is still called Godafoss, the waterfall of the gods, and it is visible from the road that runs around northern Iceland, a modest cascade in a lava landscape that carries in its name the memory of an afternoon in the year 1000 when a pagan law speaker disposed of his gods with the same decisive practicality that he had brought to the assembly's deliberations. Leif Erikson, who had been baptized at Olaf Tryggvason's court before the Althing's vote, sailed west from Norway in approximately the year 1000 with instructions from Olaf to bring Christianity to Greenland. He reached Vinland on the same voyage, or so the saga tradition records, though the Grönlänga saga and the Erik saga Roda give different accounts of the sequence of events. His mother converted in Greenland and built a church, the first in Greenland, on the site of the farm at Bratalith. His father, Erik the Red, refused conversion to the end, which the sagas attribute to his age and his nature rather than to theological conviction, and died pagan in a world that was rapidly becoming Christian around him. The Christianization of Scandinavia did not erase the old religion instantly or completely. The gods persisted in place names: Odin in Odins, Thor in Thursday, Freya in the fertility practices that continued under Christian surface forms, and the accommodation that Tjorgir had built into Iceland's conversion, the private space where old practices could continue, was probably replicated informally in many communities across the north where the new faith was publicly professed and the old habits privately maintained. The sagas, composed by Christian Icelanders in the 13th century, are full of the old religion, its cosmology, its mythology, its rituals, its figures, preserved with a care and a literary sophistication that suggests the people recording it did not regard it purely as error. They regarded it as the past, which is a different relationship, and the past was worth recording even if the present had moved on. What Christianity brought to the Norse world, alongside its theology and its clergy and its insistence on exclusive allegiance, was writing. The runic tradition had provided the Norse with a script for inscriptions, on stone, on wood, on metal, but it had not produced a manuscript culture, a tradition of extended prose composition, a means of recording law and history and genealogy in forms that could be copied and distributed and preserved across centuries. The Latin alphabet and the monastic scriptoria that used it gave Iceland, in particular, the tools to produce the literary culture that gives the Viking Age most of its texture for modern readers. The sagas are Christian compositions about a pagan world, written by literate Christian Icelanders who had access to both the oral tradition of the settlement generation and the written techniques that Christianity had imported. Without the conversion, the sagas do not exist. The old religion is preserved most fully by the faith that replaced it. Chapter 11. Finding the edge of the world. Greenland is not green. This was not a secret that Erik the Red kept from the settlers he recruited in Iceland around 905. The southwestern fjords where he had spent his 3 years of exile were, in the climate conditions of the late 10th century, genuinely habitable in a way that the name was not entirely dishonest about. The medieval warm period, which ran roughly from the 9th through the 12th centuries, had pushed the boundaries of viable agriculture further north than they would be in later centuries, and the inner fjords of Greenland's southwestern coast, sheltered from the open ocean and warmed by the land, supported grass and low scrub and the possibility of cattle farming at a latitude that would defeat the same attempt today. Erik called it Greenland because, as the Grönlänga saga records with disarming candor, men would be more willing to go there if the land had a good name. This is the oldest known example of real estate marketing in the Western Hemisphere, and it worked. Erik Thorvaldsson, Erik the Red, named for his hair and perhaps for his temper, had arrived in Iceland as a child when his father Thorvaldr was exiled from Norway for manslaughter, which established a family pattern that Erik continued with some dedication. He was exiled from one district of Iceland for killings arising from a feud, moved to another district, killed more men in another feud, and was exiled from Iceland entirely for 3 years by the Althing's judgment. He used the exile to explore the large landmass that Norse sailors had sighted to the west of Iceland, and that at least one earlier navigator, Gunnbjorn Ulfsson, had approached closely enough to see its outlying islands. Erik spent his 3 exile years sailing the southwestern and western coasts of Greenland, identifying the fjord systems that could support settlement, naming features of the landscape, and accumulating the geographic knowledge that would make him the indispensable guide for anyone who came after him. He returned to Iceland at the end of his exile with an account of what he had found, and the combination of land scarcity in Iceland. The best land had been claimed for decades, and younger sons faced the same pressures that had driven Norse settlers from Norway to Iceland a century earlier, and Eric's promotional enthusiasm produced a response that surprised even him. 25 ships departed Iceland for Greenland in the summer of 905 or 906, carrying settlers, their livestock, their equipment, and everything else that a household needed to establish itself in a new country. 14 ships completed the crossing. The others turned back or were lost. The North Atlantic between Iceland and Greenland is not a forgiving passage, and the fleet's losses in a single crossing represent a substantial proportion of the people who had committed to the voyage. Those who arrived established two settlements on the southwestern coast, the eastern settlement, in the fjords closest to the southern tip of Greenland, and the western settlement, several hundred kilometers to the north. Eric himself settled at Bretalid in the eastern settlement, a farm whose remains have been excavated and whose position, sheltered, south-facing, with access to good grazing on the hillsides above the fjord, shows the eye of a man who had spent 3 years identifying exactly where a farm could succeed. At the height of its medieval population, Greenland's Norse community held perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 people across the two settlements, a modest number by any standard, and a number that depended on a trading relationship with Norway that was never fully reliable. Greenland produced what the European luxury market wanted: walrus ivory, which was the primary material for carved objects of prestige before elephant ivory became more widely available through Mediterranean trade networks, live polar bears, which found their way to European courts as exotic gifts, white falcons, prized for hunting, and furs from the Arctic species that the Greenlandic hunters reached on their summer expeditions north into the Nordre Sita, the hunting grounds beyond the western settlement. In exchange, Greenland needed iron, which its geology could not supply, timber, which its landscape could not produce in usable quantities after the sparse initial woodland was cleared, and grain, which its climate would not support. The dependency was structural and permanent, and when the Norwegian trade became irregular in the 14th century, disrupted by plague, by changing economic priorities, by the cooling of the climate that was already beginning to stress the Greenlandic farms, the settlements had no resilience against it. But in the year 1000, the eastern settlement was a functioning community, and it was from here that the next westward movement began. The saga tradition gives two accounts of who first sighted the North American coast and in what circumstances, and the two accounts, the Grunlendika saga and Eric's saga Rorda, do not agree on the details. The Grunlender saga gives priority to a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who was blown off course sailing from Iceland to Greenland, sighted a forested coast to the west that he correctly identified as not Greenland, and sailed away without landing, a decision the saga records with a note of the criticism his crew directed at him for not investigating. Leif Erikson, by this account, purchased Bjarni's ship and sailed deliberately to explore what Bjarni had seen. Eric's saga Rorda gives Leif the discovery directly without Bjarni, and attributes the voyage to a commission from Olaf Tryggvason to bring Christianity to Greenland, with the Vinland landfall as an incidental achievement on the return journey. What the sagas agree on is the geography of what Leif found: a land of flat stones, Helluland, almost certainly Baffin Island, a land of forests, Markland, almost certainly Labrador, and a land further south where the winters were mild enough that no frost formed on the grass, and where wild grapes grew, which Leif named Vinland. The wild grapes have generated significant scholarly debate about exactly how far south Leif's Vinland extended, since the northern limit of wild grape growth in North America today is well south of Newfoundland, and the climate of 1000 CE, while warmer than today, was probably not warm enough to support grapes at the latitude of the only confirmed Norse site in North America. The possibility that Vinland's grapes were actually wild berries, perhaps gooseberries or red currants, which do grow in Newfoundland, has been raised and remains unresolved. The confirmed Norse site at Langsor Meadows, on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, was identified by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad in 1960, After Helge had spent years following the saga geography westward looking for a Norse presence in North America that most of his contemporaries doubted existed. Anne Stein's excavations between 1961 and 1968 uncovered the remains of 8 Norse buildings, longhouses and smaller structures, along with a smithy with ironworking debris, a charcoal kiln, and artifacts including a Norse-style bronze cloak pin and a soapstone spindle hall of a type made only in Greenland and Iceland at the relevant period. The site was dated by radiocarbon analysis to approximately 1000 CE. It is the only archaeologically confirmed Norse site in North America, and its identification resolved, for most purposes, the question of whether the saga's accounts of Vinland were historical. They were. Lars or Meadows was not, however, the permanent settlement that the sagas describe. Its structures show evidence of use and then abandonment, without the accumulation of occupation layers that a multi-generational settlement produces. It was more probably a base camp, a place where ships could be repaired, where iron could be smelted, where expeditions further south along the coast could be supplied and returned to, than a village in the sense that Bratalith was a village. The people who used it were passing through or operating from it seasonally, not building a community intended to last. The community intended to last was Thorfinn Karlsefni's project. Thorfinn was an Icelandic merchant of substantial means. The sagas describe him as wealthy, with good ships and the organizational capacity to mount a serious colonization attempt, who sailed to Vinland with 3 ships, roughly 60 men and 5 women, the small number of women suggesting a settlement that was planned as a trading and resource extraction base rather than a fully domestic community from the outset. He spent 3 years in Vinland, moving between several sites whose identification with specific locations in North America the sagas describe in enough geographic detail to have generated a substantial literature of proposed identifications, none of which commands universal agreement. During those 3 years, his wife Gudri Thorbjarnadottir gave birth to a son named Snorri Thorfinnsson. Snorri was born in Vinland around 1004, making him the first European child recorded as born in the Americas, a distinction that sits quietly in the saga record without particular emphasis, because the people involved had no way of knowing that they were on a continent rather than a large island at the western edge of the known world, and the birth of a child, however remarkable its location, was not the most pressing event in a settlement that was facing problems considerably more urgent than the recording of historical firsts. The problems were the Skrælings, the term the Norse used for the indigenous people they encountered, a word whose etymology is debated but whose tone in the saga sources is consistently one of otherness and unease. The first contacts were cautious and then commercial. The Skrælings came to trade, offering furs in exchange for red cloth and dairy products, and the exchange went well enough that both sides repeated it. The deterioration came through a combination of misunderstanding and the specific vulnerability of a small Norse community far from any support. A bull belonging to the settlers ran out of the forest bellowing, which frightened the Skrælings badly enough to end the trading session in alarm. When they returned in larger numbers and with a different disposition. The Norse were outnumbered and knew it. Their tactical advantage, iron weapons against opponents who had none, was real but limited by the numbers arrayed against them, and the sagas record the fighting that followed with an honesty that does not minimize how close the balance was. The figure of Freydis Eriksdottir, Erik the Red's daughter, who was in Vinland during this period, appears in the sagas at a moment of tactical crisis, when the Norse were retreating toward their houses under pressure from the Skrælings. Freydis, who was pregnant, emerged from one of the buildings, picked up a sword from a man who had fallen, and turned to face the Skrælings alone, striking the sword against her exposed chest in a gesture that the sagas suggest frightened them badly enough to break off the pursuit. Whether this happened exactly as described is impossible to determine. That it became the story the Vinland tradition chose to preserve at its most dangerous moment says something about what the tradition valued. Thorfinn concluded, after 3 years, that the settlement could not be maintained against the indigenous population without more men than he had, and that the distance from Greenland made reinforcement difficult enough that the attempt was not worth continuing at the cost it required. He loaded his ships and returned to Greenland with timber, furs, and grapes, and eventually made his way to Iceland and then to Norway, where he and Gudri were received at the royal court and their Vinland voyage discussed with interest by people who had heard the accounts but had not yet processed what they meant. Snorri, born in Vinland, grew up in Iceland, became the ancestor of several notable Icelanders, including 3 bishops, and died without ever returning to the continent of his birth. The abandonment of Vinland was not the end of Norse contact with North America. Greenlandic hunters and traders almost certainly continued to sail to Markland, the Labrador coast, for timber and furs through the medieval period, and a reference in the Icelandic Annals for 1347 records a Greenlandic ship arriving in Iceland that had been blown off course on its way back from Markland, a reference so casual that it implies the voyage was routine rather than remarkable. The distance from Greenland to Labrador was manageable, roughly the same as the distance from Norway to Iceland, and the resources of the Labrador coast were the kind that a timber-poor, fur-hungry community like Norse Greenland needed. That this contact left no permanent settlement and no lasting trace in the cultural record of the indigenous peoples of Labrador is consistent with the scale of the contact, regular enough to be useful, not intensive enough to be transformative. What the Norse found at the edge of the world was a continent that did not need them, and that had the population and the will to make that clear. They were accustomed to arriving in empty places. Iceland had been empty, Greenland had been empty, or in places so militarily and organizationally overmatched that resistance was not sustained. Vinland was neither. The Skrælings were numerous, knew their own landscape with the completeness of people who had lived in it for thousands of years, and were not impressed by Norse iron in the way that the monks of Lindisfarne had been incapable of effective resistance. The Norse retreated from Vinland not because the land was poor, the sagas are consistent that it was rich, but because taking and holding it against its existing inhabitants required resources that the small Norse world of Greenland and Iceland could not assemble at that distance. 5 centuries later, Europeans would return to the same coast with the population, the organizational capacity, and the epidemic diseases that would make the outcome different. The Norse had been there first, had found the same richness and the same resistance, and had made the rational decision that the distance and the opposition made the venture untenable. History, in this instance, belongs to those who came later. Chapter 12. The last summer of raids, nothing ended cleanly. This is the first thing to understand about the close of the Viking Age, because the temptation to assign it a date, and 1066 is the date most historians reach for, with the justification that the Battle of Stamford Bridge killed the last Norse claimant to the English throne and the Battle of Hastings installed a Norse-descended duke as English king, is a temptation that the history itself does not fully support. The Viking Age did not stop. It transformed, slowly and unevenly, into something that the participants did not experience as an ending, but that historians looking back across the whole arc can recognize as a fundamental change in what the Norse world was and what it was capable of. By the early 11th century, the raids had not ceased, but they had changed in character, larger, more organized, conducted by kings with armies rather than chieftains with ship crews, oriented toward conquest and tribute rather than the quick strike and withdrawal that had defined the early age. The world that had produced Lindisfarne's shock in 793 had become, 2 centuries later, a world in which Norse military power was so thoroughly integrated into European political competition that it was no longer distinguishable from any other form of medieval warfare. Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, began his campaign against England in the 990s with the systematic application of a pressure that Ethelred, the English king whose epithet unread meant not unready but ill-counselled, a distinction the later tradition collapsed into an unflattering nickname, was constitutionally unable to resist. Ethelred's England was wealthy, politically divided, and governed by a king who preferred payment to confrontation, which made it an ideal target for a campaign built around the extraction of tribute rather than the immediate seizure of territory. The Danegeld, the tax that Alfred had instituted to buy peace with Norse raiders and that Ethelred revived and expanded to meet Sweyn's demands, reached a scale across Ethelred's reign that has been estimated at £150,000 of silver extracted from the English population through a tax system efficient enough to produce the money but devastating enough to strain the agricultural economy that underpinned it. This silver did not disappear. It circulated through the Norse world, appearing in Scandinavian hordes, funding the ships and armies of Danish kings, and ultimately financing the campaign that would make Sweyn King of England. Sweyn's conquest in 1013 was rapid in a way that reflected how thoroughly his sustained pressure had eroded English political cohesion. He landed in the north, received the submission of the Danelaw territories, where Danish legal custom and Danish cultural memory made his arrival something closer to recognition than conquest, and moved south through a country whose resistance dissolved faster than any military analysis of Aethelred's remaining forces would have predicted. London held briefly, partly because Aethelred was still in it, but the rest of England had submitted by the end of the year. Aethelred fled to Normandy, to the court of his brother-in-law Richard, whose duchy had been built by Rollo's descendants on the same Norse foundation that Sweyn was now exploiting in England. The irony of an English king seeking refuge among Norse-descended Normans from a Norse conqueror was not the kind of irony that contemporary chroniclers pause to note, but it captures something true about how thoroughly the Norse world had embedded itself in European political life by 1013. Sweyn died in February 1014, 5 weeks after becoming King of England, a span so brief that his reign barely registers in the chronicle record, a death so sudden that it returned Aethelred from Normandy and reopened the question of English succession before Sweyn's son Knut had consolidated his position. What followed was 3 years of war between Knut and the English. Aethelred died in 1016 and his son Edmund Ironside fought Knut across the summer of that year with a competence and energy his father had rarely managed, before Edmund's death in November 1016 left Knut as the uncontested King of England. He was approximately 20 years old. Knut's reign is the Viking Age's most confounding chapter for the popular narrative, because Knut governed England not as a conqueror maintaining an occupation, but as a medieval king operating within the existing structures of English governance, and he did it with a sophistication that the popular image of Norse rulers does not accommodate. He issued law codes in the tradition of his Anglo-Saxon predecessors, drawing explicitly on the legislation of Edgar and Ethelred. He wrote letters to the English people from Rome, where he made a pilgrimage in 1027 and attended the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II, in which he reported on the concessions he had obtained for English merchants and pilgrims traveling through the continent, the letter of a king who understood that his subjects had commercial interests requiring diplomatic protection, and who had made the effort to address them in person at the highest level of European political society. He patronized the English church with a generosity that was both genuine piety and effective political investment, rebuilding the monastery at Bury St Edmunds, the house of the saint his countrymen had killed, with a completeness that converted a potential grievance into a demonstration of royal Christian virtue. He became, within a few years of his conquest, King of Denmark as well, and then King of Norway, assembling the largest political unit in Northern Europe at a moment when the possibility of a North Sea empire, England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden under a single ruler, briefly seemed like a stable political outcome rather than a personal achievement that would dissolve when the person who had achieved it died. His empire did dissolve, quickly and completely, after his death in 1035. His sons divided and lost the territories he had accumulated within 7 years. England returned to the Anglo-Saxon line, Norway recovered its own dynasty, Denmark remained Danish. The North Sea Empire lasted 1 reign and produced no institutional structures capable of outlasting the king who built it. What it produced instead was 20 years of relatively stable governance in England, during which the Norse presence in English political life was so normalized that it ceased to be remarkable, which is itself a measure of how thoroughly the two worlds had merged. The men who administered England under Knut were drawn from both Norse and Anglo-Saxon aristocratic families, operating within a legal and ecclesiastical framework that was recognizably continuous with what Alfred and his successors had built, adjusted at the edges for the new dynasty's needs and preferences but not fundamentally disrupted. The England of 1035, when Knut died, was more like the England of 975 than the disruption of 1013 might have suggested. The Norse world had absorbed England rather than replacing it, and England had absorbed the Norse world rather than being erased by it, and the result was a country that carried both inheritances forward into the middle of the 11th century without having fully resolved the tension between them. Harald Hardrada had been, By the time he turned his attention to England in 1066, one of the most experienced soldiers in the European world, he had served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople through the 1030s and 1040s, fighting across the Mediterranean from Bulgaria to Sicily to the Holy Land, accumulating wealth and military experience and the kind of reputation that the Byzantine court system rewarded with senior command. He had returned to Scandinavia in the late 1040s, claimed the Norwegian throne in 1046, and spent the following 20 years fighting Denmark in a war of attrition that neither side had fully won before a peace was finally settled. He was in his 50s in 1066, which was old for a man who had spent his adult life in active military service, and the claim to England that he pressed in that year, based on an agreement between earlier Norwegian and English kings that he interpreted as giving Norway a right to the English succession, was at least as strong as any other claim available after Edward the Confessor's death in January of that year left the throne contested between Harold Godwinson, William of Normandy, and the Norse claimant. He landed in the north of England in September 1066 with a fleet that the sources estimate at somewhere between 200 and 300 ships, a substantial force by any measure, accompanied by Harold Godwinson's exiled brother Tostig, who had his own grievances against Harold and his own reasons to support an alternative king. The army defeated the English earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Gate Fulford on the 20th of September, a victory that opened York to negotiation, and the city submitted. Harald Hardrada had, within days of landing, achieved more in the north of England than any Norse invader since the Great Heathen Army 2 centuries earlier. He was at Stamford Bridge, a crossing of the River Derwent, 8 miles east of York, on the 25th of September, waiting for hostages from the surrounding area when Harold Godwinson's army arrived. Harold had marched his forces north from London with a speed that the sources find remarkable, roughly 300 kilometers in 4 days, and the Norwegian army at Stamford Bridge was not expecting him. The weather was warm for late September, the kind of still autumn warmth that the Anglo-Saxon sources note because it was unusual, and Harald Hardrada's men had left much of their armor at the ships, which were beached further down the river at Rickle. They were caught between the armor they had left behind and the English army moving toward them across the flat Yorkshire landscape. Harald Hardrada died in the battle, killed by an arrow in the throat according to the later saga account, which places his death in the first phase of the fighting before the Norwegian forces had fully organized their defense. He had been, by the saga tradition, offered a settlement before the battle began. Harold Godwinson reportedly sent a messenger offering terms, including a grant of land for Tostig. When asked what Harald Hardrada himself would be given, the messenger replied, 7 feet of ground, or more, since he is taller than other men. It is one of the most quoted exchanges in the saga tradition, and it may or may not be historical, but it captures the tone of what Stamford Bridge meant. The Norse claim to England was being refused, finally and decisively, and the refusal was delivered with the particular bluntness of a man who had come 4 days' march to deliver it. Tostig died in the same battle. The Norwegian army, leaderless and outnumbered, was destroyed as a coherent fighting force. The survivors retreated to the ships at Rickle under terms of safe conduct, enough of them to fill perhaps 24 ships from the 300 that had arrived, and sailed home to Norway. They did not return. Harold Godwinson had 3 days to rest his army before news arrived from the south that William of Normandy had landed in Sussex on the 28th of September, 2 days after Stamford Bridge. He marched south again, gathering additional forces as he went, and met William at Hastings on the 14th of October. He was killed there. The specific manner of his death, arrow in the eye as the Bayeux tapestry suggests, or killed by cavalry as other sources indicate, remaining uncertain as the details of the battle itself remain uncertain. What is not uncertain is the outcome. William won, and with his victory the political question of who ruled England was settled in favor of a man whose family had been Norse for 5 generations and French for 5 generations simultaneously, whose duchy had been built by Rollo's followers on a Norse foundation and had spent a century and a half becoming something that was neither Norse nor Frankish but Norman, which was its own thing entirely. The Norman conquest ended the Viking Age not by defeating it, but by completing it. William the Conqueror was the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, who had accepted the lower scene in 911 from a Frankish king who needed someone to defend the coast against people exactly like Rollo. The Norse energy that had gone outward from Scandinavia across 2 centuries had reached England not through Stamford Bridge, but through Hastings, not through Harald Hardrada's direct claim, but through the transformed, Christianized, feudalized, French-speaking descendant of the man who had refused to kneel at St. Clair-sur-Epte. The shore that had been broken at Lindisfarne in 793 was reorganized, finally, by a man who could trace his blood to the same Scandinavian source as the men who had broken it, and who would have been unrecognizable to them. What remained was not nothing. The Norse place names persisted in the Danelaw landscape, as they persist today. The legal vocabulary of the wapentake and the riding continued in administrative use for centuries. The words that had crossed from Old Norse into English, sky and window and husband and knife and egg and the rest of the long list, were already too embedded to be removed, too ordinary to be noticed as borrowings, too useful to be replaced. Iceland continued to produce its sagas, composing in the 13th century the literary record of a world that had already passed, preserving in prose the memory of the settlement generation and the centuries of expansion and the gods that had governed the old religion and the ships that had made everything possible. The Althing met at Thingvellir. The Varangian Guard served in Constantinople until the city itself fell to the Ottomans in 1453. Norse no longer in any genetic sense, but Norse in its institutional identity, carrying the name and the axe forward long past the world that had created it. The ships rotted in their harbors and their beaches, or were broken up for timber, or were buried with the men who had sailed them, and the wood that had carried Norse people from the Norwegian coast to the shores of 3 continents returned, slowly and without ceremony, to the soil from which it had been cut. In the still water of a sheltered fjord, the sound of a hull shifting against a mooring rope in the small hours, timber settling, water moving, the light knock of wood against wood in the quiet, was the sound of a world at rest between voyages, holding its breath before the next departure. The departures had already stopped. The water moved against the empty hulls, and the morning came without sails, and the age that had opened with a shock of oars on a Northumbrian shore folded itself quietly into the longer history of the world it had helped to make. The journey is complete. Rest well.